It's Tuesday, August 9th, and this is a meeting of the Council of the Town of Oakville. And it's my pleasure to invite you to stand and join council in O Canada. Thank you, everybody. In 1820, Indigenous people here began welcoming settlers from all over the empire. Soon, they were helping slaves escaping from the United States to settle here too. Today, our Indigenous founding partners are still here enjoying this land with us. They fish and camp under their treaty rights. Indigenous people in their thousands also live with us as neighbors and friends. Our Indigenous white and Black founders created a community with an attractive degree of harmony and prosperity. In 1857, Ontario gave official recognition of Oakville as a town. At Town Hall, all of these years later, we fly the flag of the Mississaugas of the Credit beside the flags of Oakville, Ontario, and Canada. We fly these flags together to acknowledge our origins. People from all over the world are attracted now to the livability we have created. We offer newcomers a warm spirit of welcome. We offer everyone our founding story so everyone knows what we are part of. We feel sorrow and distress for acts of racism and intolerance suffered across Canada and here at home, and we want our future to be equitable and inclusive for all. The path of truth and reconciliation can unite us all. Please keep well, stay safe, and let us on council know of any chance to be helpful to you and yours. And please let us know anytime you can help increase Oakville's harmony, prosperity, and livability. Madam Clerk, I understand we have no regrets for this council meeting tonight.
That's correct.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Council, are there any declarations of pecuniary interest tonight? Madam Clerk, I see no declarations. Council, I'd like to attract your attention to the confirmation of minutes of the previous council meetings listed in the agenda. That's July 11th and July 12th. And for July 12th, the motion would be that the minutes of the Planning and Development session of council dated July 11th, 2022 be approved, and that the minutes and confidential minutes of the regular session of council dated July 12th be approved. Is there a mover and seconder for that motion? Councillor Dudek, thank you. Councillor Elger, thank you. Any objection to the motion or corrections? There being none, that's carried. We have no public presentations this evening, but it would be in order for two of us to move and second resolving into committee of the whole. Councillor Longo and Councillor Lischina, thank you. Any objection? There being no objection, that motion carries. We have a registered delegation for consent item 7.4. Let me see if I can get a motion for the rest of the consent items. There is no confidential consent item. I saw Councillor Robertson first, and Councillor O'Meara, you've had a hand up, so I don't know which way you're going on this.
Well, I'm sure Councillor Robertson wants to do the same thing I do, so I'll let her go.
Okay. Councillor Robertson? I take it, I don't know. Are you moving the balance of the items as I asked?
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
Mayor
Councillor-
Burton, sorry.
Yes,
Hello,
Councillor
sorry.
Sandu?
Sorry, thank you, Mayor Burton. I'd like to separate 7.3, please.
All right.
Thank you.
Councillor O'Meara?
And yeah, sorry, Your Worship, I'd like to separate 7.2 as well.
All right. So 7.1 and 7.5 and 7.6 are being moved by Councillor Robertson, and 7.2 and 7.3 and 7.4 will occupy us in a moment. Any objection to Councillor Robertson's motion? There being none, that means that 3 of the consent items have been consented to. So let's go next to 7.2, and this is the Region Pumping Station in Brawny Beach. Councillor O'Meara?
Thank you, Your Worship, for the opportunity to speak to this item. Earlier today, the clerk did circulate around 2 other amendments to the motion that I'd like to bring forward and add on to here. We met with our regional commissioner and staff on the need for the pumping station as it's at its end of life. But there's going to be a second story built in the Brawny Beach area. There's going to be a lot of disruption and a lot of construction going on there. And we had spoke about the need to, when we build back with our infrastructure now, we build back better. And we don't just put in there, a large building, but we try to see what we can do within our means to make things a little bit better than they were. As many of you may know, that there is a phase 2 to the Brawny Beach in our capital works plans. And right now there's an opportunity and there's an expectation from our residents that we're going to start to see some movement along with that. So working with our Parks Department and actually the commissioner at the region fully expected to have these amendments that I've put forward here. I'll just read them off for the people watching. So for that, in addition to the recommendations there, 4 would say that in using the Build Back Better approach, the region be requested to cost share with the planned town phase 2 improvements at the Brawny Beach Park that will incorporate the pumping station in a plan that benefits the residents of Oakville, and that staff report back to council once discussions have been completed. Your Worship, I'd like to move those amendments.
Okay.
Item, please.
So, Councillor O'Meara, it's in order that you move the recommendation with these additions. Is everybody clear on the councillor's motion? Is there any objection to the councillor's motion? Councillor, your motion carries. I see no objection to it. Thank you, everybody. Let's turn now to 7.3, and this is the North Park Development Community Center Library and Park naming. Councillor Sanju, was that you?
That is me. Thank you, Mayor Burton. I just wanted to actually just take this opportunity to say thank you so much to staff. It was exciting to read this report, obviously because this is in Ward 7, but also because of the practicality of the aspects of it. I know that the community had really been using this space for a very, very long time, and for us to have that consistency of approach over time, I think is very well received. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to say thanks again.
Thank you very much for those remarks. Let me see if your positive view of this is enough to move it also. That's a yes, I take it.
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Council, the item is moved by Councillor Sanju. Is there any objection? Councillor Sanju, your motion carries successfully. Thank you very much for that. And 7.4, we have a registered delegation on this, and as I understand it, that's Richard Brocking, and he might be in person. And Mr. Brocking, we welcome you to the central podium here, and we look forward to your information. And we customarily give people up to 10 minutes. I know from previous communications with you, it won't take you that long, but anyway, you're welcome.
You're being sarcastic, I'm assuming, Mayor,
No.
Mayor Burton.
No, I'm sincere.
I can be rather loquacious. Good evening, members of Oakville Town Council. I wish to begin my presentation tonight. First with a request, and then a clarification of what is likely to be an unfortunate discrepancy, and third, a word of gratitude. First then, a request. I am a certified Ontario high school teacher. English and manufacturing, though sadly not currently practicing. And I have apparently been out of the classroom much too long, and it is for this reason, in addition to the immense detail in my presentation, that I will be tied to my manuscript tonight. And it's tempting when reading to speak much too quickly, and should this occur, please interrupt me and instruct me to speak more slowly. Second, I wish to confirm that councillors and I will be making reference to the same document, namely the report prepared by the Parks and Open Space Department dated July 26, 2022, entitled Update Fishing Restrictions. I intend to make numerous explicit and implicit references to this report dated July 26, 2022, and mass confusion is apt to ensue if we are not all referring to the same document. I note that page 3 of tonight's agenda refers under 7.4, recommendation 1, to a July 6, 2022 report. And I wish to confirm that July 6, or the report's 26 for that matter, constitutes a simple typographical error. It would be prudent to sort out this discrepancy before we proceed. So are we referring to a July 26, 2022 report, which was readily available on the town's website?
Sir, the clerk is confirming your theory. So you're right.
Yeah, that's correct? Thank you. So we're all referring to the July 26, 2022 report. Thank you. Finally, by way of introduction, I would be remiss not to thank the town of Oakville at the outset for allowing members of the public to present thus at council meetings. An old Jewish proverb states, as iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another, and I trust this proverb will prove true tonight. So I'll now turn my attention to the report in question and attempt to show its deficiencies. Page number 1, key fact number 5, states that the pilot program fishing restrictions have been accepted by the community and alleges that, quote, no concerns have been brought forward by residents or stakeholders, end of quote. This allegation is false. I've been fishing the town of Oakville harbors primarily for Chinook salmon from mid-August to early November every year for over 30 years, and I therefore regard myself to be a stakeholder with many of my fellow town of Oakville anglers. I've expended a significant amount of time and energy raising my concerns since later summer 2020, after having discovered in June 2020, during a Father's Day celebration at the base of the Brawny East Pier, that the town had posted no fishing May to October signs on my beloved East Pier. I have talked at length via telephone with Mr. Crawford's office, with Mr. O'Meara, with a bylaw enforcement officer, and with Mr. Ball. I also wrote emails to some or all members of council and to prominent town employees, including Mr. Mark, Director of Parks and Open Space, on September 4, 2020 at 12:54 a.m., on September 21, 2020 at 10:12 a.m., and again on September 15, 2021 at 1:06 p.m., including Mr. Mark on that final email. No one has bothered to respond directly to my emailed concerns, and now I am being informed that, quote, no concerns have been brought forward by stakeholders. Key fact number 5 of the report. Nor have signs been posted informing anglers that the pilot project would be voted on in summer 2022, or even that a pilot project existed. Furthermore, I do not know of any anglers amongst my many contacts who were informed by town employees or contractors face-to-face or by way of email that the pilot project would be voted on in summer of 2022. This may help to explain why this meeting is thinly attended by my fellow anglers. I do not see many in attendance here, unfortunately, who are in agreement with me as regards my concerns. Needless to say, I am extremely disappointed. I wish now to review some of the concerns I have previously raised with councillors, with Mr. Burton's office, and with Mr. Mark, and also introduce a couple new ones. Time prevents me from detailing all of my concerns. I hope I can get through them all. I notice we're now at about the 5-minute mark. First, in the background section of the July 26, 2022 report, it is implied that one cause of the recommended permanent fishing restrictions is heavy boat traffic in and out of Oakville and Brawny harbors and interference between shorebound harbor anglers and boaters. I therefore am puzzled that the report proposes no restrictions at all on the Bronte West Pier, the so-called break wheel. break wall, rather. Indeed, a short cast in the direction of the east pier from an angler on the end of the west pier will come in the path of incoming or outgoing vessels. I'm therefore obliged to wonder if there is more behind the recommended permanent restrictions, because to be consistent, the end of the west pier should be shut down to pier anglers 24 hours a day between May and October, just as the entire east pier now is. Second, the report makes no mention that the options for shorebound Lake Ontario anglers pursuing late summer and early fall Chinook salmon have very limited options in the town of Oakville, only Oakville and Brawny harbors. The Skyway Bridge piers are not suitable as there is no river mouth here, and the fish rapidly pass under the bridge into Hamilton Harbor. The Credit River mouth is not ideal for the physically disabled, as the rocks from which anglers must fish present a significant challenge to the disabled. Moreover, the Credit River mouth is a very busy angling destination, being in Mississauga. Incidentally, in a September 8, 2020 email to some councillors and to the mayor's office, I mentioned having providentially met in early September 2020 a group of 4 young men, including one in a wheelchair, who were hoping to fish the Bronte East Pier for Chinook salmon about 9 p.m. on a Saturday. I mentioned the new restrictions and the possibility of a $300 fine per offending angler, and the group promptly left. They had come from Mississauga to Bronte, foregoing the closer Credit River mouth because the Bronte East Pier is ideal for handicapped anglers. I wonder if the handicapped man could sue for discrimination. And I wonder if the group decided to go to the bar instead. It is certainly possible. Pursuing and hooking into a healthy Chinook salmon is a lot of fun, and young and older men can be recovered from a bad course or prevented from entering upon one if, being limited to shore fishing for salmon, reasonable opportunities abound. 3, the report does not mention that the best shore fishing for Chinook salmon on the northwestern shore of Lake Ontario is between mid-August, depending on the prevailing weather trends, and Thanksgiving Day. The East Pier has had, since June 2020, an enforced and complete ban on fishing from mid-May to mid-October. 4, the report does not mention that salmon are a nocturnal species, especially in Lake Ontario harbors, on account of far heavier boat traffic during the daylight hours, which renders the fish shy, and on account of increasing water clarity due to the accidental introduction of zebra mussels in the 1990s. The Chinook salmon tend to stay in deeper water during daylight hours, out of range of shore anglers. 5, the report does not mention that boat traffic decreases dramatically at dusk. 6, the report does not mention that the very best Chinook salmon fishing for shore anglers is when the winds are contrary for boaters. This is most ironic. 7, the report does not mention that boaters may be at fault when disputes arise between shore anglers and boaters. Relatively recently, a boater who was renting a slip in the Brawny Inner Harbor was charged with impaired operation of a marine vessel when he was found grounded off Coronation Park just east of the harbor. The report does not mention how many impaired charges have been laid by the Halton Police Marine Unit against boaters. Indeed, the subject of alcohol as a potential cause of confrontations between anglers and boaters is completely avoided. The report does not mention, this is number 8, the report does not mention that pier pedestrians may be a cause of disputes with anglers. How many pier pedestrians have alcohol in their system after visiting Brawny's lively, licensed restaurant and bar scene? It is very telling to me that beginning with the 2020 patio season, Oakville has permitted seasonal closures of a section of Marine Drive in favor of licensed dining. At the same time, fishing restrictions began to be enforced, ironically. 9, the report does not mention that although no fishing signs are prominently displayed all along the Bronte East Pier, this park closes at 10 p.m. signs are conspicuously absent. This greatly disturbs me. I visited both Brawny Piers last week Saturday evening and took many instructive photos along these lines. I noted several pedestrians walking the East Pier after 10 p.m. Bylaw was not to be seen. At least 2 of the pedestrians were observed smoking cigarettes in the short time it took me to walk from the end of the East Pier to its beginning shortly after 10 p.m. Smoking or vaping is not permitted on the pier, per signs. 10, the report does not mention that the West Pier is off limits to anglers after 10 p.m. year-round. So to make much fanfare about the absence of restrictions on the West Pier does not demonstrate sophisticated thinking. Indeed, West Pier anglers must cross Parkland, which closes at 10 o'clock p.m. to get to the pier. I remind you that successful fishing for Chinook salmon during daylight hours from Oakville and Brawny Piers is a major challenge even for the most skilled angler. I notice I'm at the 10-minute mark.
I believe you did pass the 10-minute mark. Would you like a minute to wind up with what you want us to do?
Well, I have a couple of suggestions. I would ask that we seriously consider, I've made these suggestions previously, Mr. Mayor. I would ask that we seriously consider opening up the Tannery Park piers and the Brawny East Pier for overnight fishing, in as much as the boat traffic and the pedestrian traffic decreases dramatically after 9 p.m., and particularly after Labor Day, when kids are back in school and families are much busier. And again, it would only have to be, I think, for it would be mid-August to mid-October. A lot of anglers come to the piers in Brawny, to a lesser extent to Oakville, for the salmon. And the salmon don't start running really until September 1st. If you know what you're doing and the weather's right, you can catch them pretty good starting mid-August. So I've made these suggestions in the past, but I haven't received any feedback. I would also ask that we very seriously and objectively canvass the shore fishing community for its opinions. And as far as I can learn, there is no evidence that this has been done. And finally, I would urge pier pedestrians to consider that they have daylight hours to walk the piers. And walking opportunities exist elsewhere along Oakville's waterfront, including Coronation Park, whereas shore-bound Chinook salmon anglers have very limited opportunities, and that the season is very brief, at most a mere 8 weeks. And those are my 3 suggestions, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the detailed proofreading of the report, the errors in which I'm sure we regret, and thank you for the suggestions.
Thank you.
Councillor Duddick?
Thank you, Your Worship. I wonder if there'd be some appetite for deferring this and referring it back to staff to have an opportunity to consider the various points that have been raised, just for our benefit and for the public's benefit, and have the opportunity for staff to respond to some of the comments made this evening. It might be helpful just for one cycle.
Thank you, Councillor Duddick, for the motion to refer back to staff for a cycle. Is there any objection to Councillor Duddick's motion? Councillor Elgar?
It's not, I'm not against her motion at all. I just wonder whether if one cycle is enough time. I wonder if just staff could comment. Like if it takes 2 cycles, fine. I like where she's going. And I just wonder whether 1 cycle will be enough time to adequately address all the issues that were raised.
Mr. Mark, do you have an opinion on how long you'd like? We'll come to you in a second, Councillor Haslett-Deal.
Good evening, Mayor Burton. 1 cycle is a bit tight, given other work that we're undertaking right now. So yeah, probably 2 cycles would certainly be preferable from a staff perspective.
That's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Mark. Councillor Haslett-Deal.
Thank you, Mayor Burton. I just have one, I'm supportive of Councillor Duddick's suggestion, but I have one question of clarification that when the report comes back, in regards to ensuring that the fishing restrictions do not impact Indigenous persons' treaty rights to fish. I just think it would be helpful that it's documented in the report. If that could be considered, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Councillor. Director Mark has shaken his head yes, which you may not have been able to see. Councillor Chisholm.
Thank you, Worship. I'm supportive of Councillor Duddick's deferral. The other question too is the access to where, and we know we have very limited access to the lake with our harbors and so forth, but always a concern is, you know, we have chartability down there with the boat and so forth, but access by our disabled and wheelchairs and so forth for fishing is almost non-existent. So can we also identify and highlight in the report what access or what we need to do to incorporate that as part of the inclusivity with respect to our disabled patrons who want to fish down the lake?
Yes, Councillor, we can.
Thank you.
Councillor Haslett-Deal again. All righty. Thank you, everybody. Is there any objection to Councillor Duddeck's motion to refer to staff for 2 cycles to update the report? Councillor Duddeck, your motion has succeeded. There's no objection. Thank you, everybody. I believe that we have now actually managed to do all of the consent items. And that brings us to our first discussion item. And for the Community Benefits Charge Strategy, we have a presentation from Gary Scanlon from Watson Associates, our consultant on this matter. This is a pretty crucial matter, and it goes to our ability to finance a significant part of growth. Mr. Scanlon, I see you on the Zoom. Are you ready? Then you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think the presentation is being pulled up. Yeah. So I just briefly, I think I've spoken to council before on, the change in the planning legislation, which has brought us to preparing this strategy. So I'll go through an overview again and then discuss some of the mechanics of it and what we'd be asking you to consider as part of a CBC bylaw, community benefit charge bylaw. Next slide, please. And this is just generally the steps that I'll go through. Next slide, please. So the process, we have been working with staff for about 9 or 10 months. They've been very helpful in our discussions. We've been through senior leadership, and we did do a council workshop back in April. Subsequent to that, we've had a discussion with the development community, and as you'll see in the mid part of this month, we'll also be re-engaging with them to provide an overview of the report and the bylaw. There is a requirement for us to engage with the community. It is not as strict as the Development Charges Act, where you must have a statutory public meeting, but there is a requirement to engage in dialogue with the development community, which, as you can see, we will have done 2 times before we ask council to consider the bylaw. So we would look to be back for adoption in September 6th. Next slide, please. And again, please. So if you recall historically, under the Planning Act, you had the ability to impose a community benefit charge. Section 37 was actually nicknamed bonus zoning. And what that meant was if you were of a higher density or a higher height than what the general provisions for that area would provide, council could approve that heightened development, but you could then negotiate with the individual developer to provide an additional benefit to the community, which could be cash, which would be towards some type of asset. They could provide public art. They could provide many different elements as a dedication to the municipality. What they've done now is they've changed the rules on it, and they've provided that any developments that are at a minimum 5 stories high and include at least 10 residential units are now eligible for this new charge. Now, the charge is a maximum of 4% of the value of the land the day before building permit. So that is basically what we're trying to demonstrate through this calculation, is to do a growth forecast, look at the developments that fit into that category, assess the land values associated with it, and then look at the capital needs in the future. And we basically take the capital needs, divide it by the value of the land. And if it's 4% or higher, then we can impose the maximum charge, which is, once again, the 4%. If our calculations say something less than that, then that's what we provide for our bylaw. Maybe it's 2%, 3%, whatever. So that's the exercise that we are going through in order to demonstrate, and that's been expressed in the background document, which is called a strategy not a background study like the development charge. Next slide. And just as at a high level, this is kind of the steps that the legislation provides for us. The green at the top identify the development that fits into that category. As we move down, identify servicing needs, different types of capital costs. And they could be, for the most part, they're non-development charge costs. Anything that doesn't fit into the development charge could be considered as part of this charge. And that's what those kind of dark blue boxes are demonstrating. Non-DC, we can get contributions towards Parkland Dedication. Anything that you would have done historically under the former legislation, you can still continue. So we have those costs. They're like development charges, those orange boxes. There's a number of deductions. We come down with a net cost, and then we divide that net cost by the land values in order to determine that 4%. So at a very high level, that's the steps that we go through. Next slide. And again, please. So we've looked at a 10-year planning horizon, and this planning horizon looks to, over the next 10 years, look at about over 16,000 units, residential units in the community. There's about over 4,000 that would be your singles and semi-detached, another 4,000 for multiples, leaving about 8,200 units, which are the high density. Not all of that high density will meet that 5-story and minimum 10 units. So only about 69% of it will. And that's what we've identified there. About 5,600 units in total would be fitting the criteria depicted by the legislation. We move ahead to the next slide. As I've noted, the charge is 4% of the value of the land the day before building permit. So part of our calculations are to take a look at the average value of the land in different areas of the town. We've had Robson Associates, a very esteemed appraiser in the town, assist the town in putting this information together. And you can see that the value of the land, depending where you're developing this high density, ranges from about $6 million at the low end and up as high as over $28 million, say in the downtown of Oakville. So we've looked at these values. Those 5,600 units that I talked about before, we've looked to allocate where they're going to be developing, and we're trying to incorporate all of that into our calculations, and we'll show you that in a moment in one of the other slides. Next slide. And this slide in particular does, if you can see those areas that we talked about before. The second column from the left identifies the units. And if we take a look at the densities of those developments, then the second to the last column on the right gives you the associated number of acres we would expect to develop in order to house all of those units. So we'd be looking at about 41 acres. And just doing the math of the acres times the land value, we would expect that the value of all of these high density lands that are going to develop in today's dollars are about $293 million. So it's quite a sizable amount of development, or just the land value in which the developments will be occurring on. Next slide. And one more, please. Now, I've noted we've gone through with staff and worked through a detailed capital listing. For the most part, the projects we're considering are those projects in your 10-year capital plan that aren't eligible for development charge funding. And that could be municipal administration buildings, museums, public art, heritage, affordable housing, public realm improvements, etc. What you used to collect under section 37. So that's the second bullet, potentially parkland acquisition, etc. The fourth bullet, there is a notation in the legislations that says we could include DC eligible projects if they weren't included in the development charge. But our suggestion to staff is completely separate what types of projects are funded by the CBCs versus what type of projects are funded by DCs. And we've done that in the analysis that we've provided. Next slide, please. So if we go back to the calculations, you can see this is where we've tried to identify the actual percentage. We've got in total, working with staff, about $122 million in capital. You can see, there's parks, recreation, predominantly culture, about $20 million in projects, general admin about 10, municipal parking in the 90 range, and then additional CBC studies into the future, 225. We have to make these deductions, and at the end of the day, we end up with about $14 million in net costs that would be eligible. Or it's of the 293, about we've been able to identify about 5% of the value of the land would be eligible to fund these projects. Now, as I stated, the Act maximizes the charge at 4%. So even though we were able to calculate and identify a higher amount, we're going to be limited to the cap that the province has put in. So we'd be able to recover 4% of all land, the value of the land for all of these higher density developments that will occur into the future. Next slide. And once again, another place. The province, in the wisdom, wish to exempt certain types of development, so they have mandatorily excluded the charge being imposed on these types of developments. So obviously anything that doesn't, any residential development that doesn't meet that 5-story with the 10 units, obviously like medium or low density, they're not included for this charge. Redevelopment of an existing building that doesn't fit this criteria. Long-term care homes or retirement homes won't be imposed. Colleges, university, and indigenous institutes. Different types of facilities associated with the Royal Canadian Legion, not for profit, and then hospices. So you can see the province has an even more expanded list of exemptions than what they would do under the Development Charges Act. Next slide, please. So we've prepared the background study. It's mandatory that we have that along with the bylaw. There's the engagement process that I've spoken of. We've started that with the development community. We'll be circling back to answer any of their questions in mid-August. And then based on those comments, we will come back and dialogue with council and hopefully seek your consideration of the proposed bylaw. And I think that completes my presentation, Mr. Mayor. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Scanlon. There's a few questions, and I'd like to just confirm something you said. The shortfall on the percentage calculation, the 0.009% shortfall, that means we're short $2.6 million approximately, just there alone. Is that right?
That's correct.
And in your work, did you calculate the cost of these mandatory exemptions?
No, I haven't, Mr. Mayor. That's something that when we come back, we can take a look at either developments that are coming through the process. That's probably the easiest way to look at it. We might have a little bit of a historic look as well, but we could come back with a calculation or an estimate for you.
Well, it's just probably really important for residents and taxpayers to understand what they're being asked to pay for. Councillor Elger.
Mayor Burton, I do believe you asked the questions I was going to ask. I was looking for the number, and Jerry, it is 2.6 million more we throw onto the back of the existing taxpayers to subsidize the development. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And how much, okay, I guess when we got the development charges, how much are we already putting on the back now?
My memory isn't as good as yours, Counselor. I'd have to go back to a couple of months ago when we provided that figure for you, but I'll have that as well available for you.
At the next meeting.
Absolutely.
I think that's all, that's really what is important. I know that's all you can do, but I really think people have to learn that development doesn't pay for the development at all. We are all of us are subsidizing. So I thank you. And I get not much more we can do about that, I guess, at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor O'Meara.
Thank you, Your Worship. So just to clarify on the exemption side, the retirement home, so that includes the $1 billion pension fund, private for-profit retirement homes are exempt from this. Is that, am I understanding that right?
I'm not sure if there's a specific development you're speaking of, Counselor.
Private
but
for-profit retirement homes, are they exempt?
it just generally, if it's a registered retirement home, no matter if it's for-profit or not for profit, I would believe that it's exempt.
Okay, thanks for that. My second question is how do, so what does the money go into a CBC reserve, or does it just become a part of our capital budget process? Like once we collect the money, where does it go and how is it specifically allocated to whatever projects we've, like what's the mechanism there where that sort of gets used?
It's a very good question, Counselor. So through you, Mr. Mayor, similar to development charges, the money gets collected and it gets put into a specific reserve. From there, there is a requirement for you to allocate or commit 60% of the reserve fund money every year. Doesn't mean that it has to be spent in the following year, but it means that you would have to be allocating it to specific projects. So that this goes back to the project listing that we provided in the background study. Now, there could be some refinements to it, adjustments, as long as it's meeting the categories of eligible costs. So that can be funded, Counselor. It's just that it'll be up to staff as part of the capital budget process to rationalize those revenues and come back to council with their recommendation of what uses the specific projects will receive those funds.
So in the past, the Section 37 money had to be spent in the community, really where the development was. So now it's going to be a town-wide capital project sort of allotment, I guess. Is that correct?
That's correct. It can be used throughout the town.
And is that prescribed by the provincial legislation, or will this council be able to get together and decide, okay, here's where, we want to spend this money in this area? Or I guess I'm just trying to figure out where does council get to have an input on this? Would that be during the budget process then?
Absolutely. During the annual capital budget, that's where staff will identify specifically the use of those funds. And that's where council can engage with staff and prioritize the projects and the funding.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Giddings.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Great questions so far. Thank you for asking. And in the staff report, it talked about the CBC provides an opportunity to continue to utilize this growth financing tool for capital costs that can't be collected for using DCs or Parkland dedication. On one of your slides, 10 or 11, I believe, it talked about Parkland acquisition and for Parkland dedication related. Could you just run that by me once again?
Absolutely. And through you, Mr. Mayor. For Parkland dedication, you have the ability under the Planning Act, different sections, 42 and 51 and 53, to collect either a dedication of land, which at 5% for res and institution, or 2% for commercial and industrial, or you could get a contribution of 1 hectare for 300 units. So you have to go through a process to impose those requirements by bylaw, and then that allows you to do that. Now, quite often, if your needs are basically at, let's say, 6 or 7, I don't know, acres per 1,000 people, you go through the dedications and it will only generate, let's say, 5 acres per 1,000 people. You're going to have a funding gap, and that gap is allowed to be moved in and funded through the CBC revenues. So only land acquisition, so you can get it under one aspect of the Planning Act, but you can top up through this particular mechanism. The parkland development is paid for under development charges. So we kind of have, for parks, we kind of have 3 different pools of money to use in order to provide for the development, for the acquisition of the land and the development of the parks.
Thank you. Would that be top up to the limit of the lesser or the greater amount under the various scenarios?
It would be the top up to whatever your park policies are, which you have, let's say in the official plan, it's normally determined what your targets are, and it's reaffirmed through, let's say, a parks master plan. And those, the approval of those documents give us guidance on how much land you can, that you desire. And then we can work through the mechanics of how much land you can actually receive using the appropriate sections of the Planning Act. And most municipalities I talk to always have a gap in between what they desire for their land and what they can acquire through the Planning Act provisions.
All right, thank you for that. I think we're getting into the next agenda item. In terms of, and this can be spent on public realm improvements.
Correct.
And an example of that?
There could be a variety of things that, let's say, community gardens might be something that you might want to invest in. There could be public art, there could be murals, there could be a number of different assets that, would benefit the public. So
All right, I'll thank you for that. The community gardens example is great, but the community gardens would have had to have been included under the parkland requisite to be able to.
not necessarily.
All right, so there can be parkland acquisition on top of.
Well, the community, I'm thinking of the community gardens as being, if you want to make available for people to grow their own food.
Land plots, sure.
That isn't necessarily parkland where you're going to go out with your son or grandson or grandchild and throw a ball or a frisbee around. It kind of messes up the vegetables a little bit. So, it would be distinct from pure parkland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scanlon.
My pleasure.
Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Giddings. Councillor Robertson?
Councillor O'Meara did the first parts of my questions, which was definitely about where and how the communities who are experiencing growth right now feel the benefit of the growth they're experiencing. The disruption, the amount of new traffic, everything in a community for which we've always had bonusing as a means of saying, well, you've gone through all of this and this is going to better our community because we're also going to add this. So one of my concerns, I guess, is definitely what you said about the fact that it goes into a central pool and that it's just, I guess, fighting at budget time for whatever. But the second one goes on to Councillor Giddings in terms of the public realm improvements. Who will determine whether that counts or doesn't count?
Well, a lot of times it's, through the budget process, I think we have a lot of dialogues with the finance staff. So they are the ones I would perceive are most knowledgeable about it, but quite often we get phone calls, 5-10 minute phone calls, which is, part of our aftercare. And if there's questions and such, we're more than happy to answer the questions of staff with respect to any of those items.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Chisholm.
Thank you, Worship. Just on the same lines with respect to the community benefits, the dollars coming in, is there appropriate, and maybe I'm getting in the weeds and this is something that's down the line, with respect to the selection of projects that are done within the area for improvements? The word improvements, that's a concern of mine. Is that, so for example, if we have existing assets in an area where there has been a development, we have the dollars in the account, can that be considered like redevelopment? Let's use the garden plots. The garden plots are not in good disarray. We want to expand it. We want to redo it. Is that eligible, or is this just looking at new startup assets or projects within CBC?
So a very good question, Councillor, and through the mayor. The legislation finds a lot of similarities in the wording and the references to the Development Charges Act. So the Development Charges Act has been around for 65 years, and we've got over 150 case law which get into the minutia of definitions. So we have used very similar definitions that we would use for development charges. So when we take a look at this, so that if the rule of thumb, or whatever the definition has evolved towards, is if an improvement, if you're expanding the capacity of the asset to accommodate additional growth or additional hours of production, or as long as you're expanding the capacity, then a portion of that cost can be funded by either DECs if they're eligible services, or under this. So that, if you were, I don't know, if you were taking some type of asset and expand it. I'm going to use the municipal, your town hall as an example. If your town hall was 200,000 square feet and you were going to replace it and go to 300,000 square feet, we might be able to fund, like a third of that building would be expansion or expanding the capacity to service more growth. That would then be something, that portion that would be the expansion, we could consider under the CBC.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Chisholm. Councillor Knoll.
Thank you, Worship. I'm hoping that I didn't just miss this. I was trying to read ahead to the end of the chapter to try to understand something, but I just want to be clear on the 4%. When the 4% is determined at the point of building permit, is it based on the here and the value at that day, or the developed value, the anticipated developed value? And how is that actually determined? Who does the determination on that? Is that a third party? Is it how does that work?
So a very good question once again, Councillor. The value is the day before building permit.
Okay.
So it's based on vacant land, not developed land. There's a process where the municipality and the developer can exchange appraisals. And I think what we have here is for the town to undertake the appraisal. The developer can consider it. If the developer doesn't like it, they can get their own. If both can't agree, then they go to a third party. So that there is a process of dialogue in between the developer and the town, and you can go up to 3 appraisals to justify the value. But the value is the day before building permit.
The day before the building permit at the then marketable value of the property. Okay.
It's the market value of the property.
So this seems like an opportunity for lots of dispute between parties. I'm curious, I saw in the report, or actually, I guess it's either in the bylaw or the report where it said that it can be appealed to, or there's a process for dealing with disputes under the Act. What is that process? Is it to the OLT? Is there another body? Is it the courts?
It's through the OLT, any appeals.
Okay. Yet another avenue for appeal. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for your answers. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Council, for your many fine questions. Mr. Scanlon, when you were last before us for development charges, I think you made it very clear that development charges are based on a list of specific capital projects anticipated to be needed and an estimate of what they would cost. And there's an adjustment mechanism at the end of each development charge bylaw to credit or debit everyone concerned. In this presentation, I thought I heard you say, but much more briefly, that this process for the CBC also may start with a list of projects that are anticipated to be needed. And that list, would you be able to confirm for council that list would be at some point brought before council and approved by council when it passed its CBC bylaw?
Under a distinction, good question once again, Mr. Mayor. There's a distinction in the Development Charges Act where there's an actual clause that says that the capital works have to be part of an official plan. Official plan, capital budget, or a similar expression of council. Now, if we're going out long-term, like 20 years, obviously, we may not see specific projects sitting in a 5-year capital budget or certainly in the official plan. So we always ask council to consider and bless the projects. But the DEC is specifically related to individual projects. With this particular process, obviously, we've identified a number of projects through what are being identified in master plans or part of the capital budget, and that listing is complete as of today. But you can see that we're not able to fully fund it. So we may see, certain projects getting the maximum we can attribute to the CBC from the CBC money. And there may be other projects that will get nothing because there's no more money left.
Right.
Unfortunately, that's the way it is. And that's why during the capital budget process, there's going to have to be a discussion between members of council and staff on how to allocate those funds.
Yes, of course. The point I'm chasing, though, with you is I didn't want people left with the inadvertent impression that this created some kind of piggy bank the use of which could be determined entirely in the future rather than being generated by master plans and other capital projects that are in fact brought before council for approval in order to be established. And so, and thank you for confirming that council picks the destinations for these monies in its master plans and its other financial planning. That's the point I wanted to be clear. Council, we have registered delegations. A gentleman, who's no stranger to many of us, Mr. Ira Kagan from Kagan Shastri LLP, and he's representing BUILD, which is the Association of the Builders and Land Developers. And Mr. Kagan's job is to usually tell us that we're asking too much. Mr. Kagan, prove me wrong.
Thank you, Mayor Burton and members of council. Can you all hear me? I'm connected virtually.
We hear you perfectly and see you pretty well too.
Thank you very much. I'm legal counsel for BUILD with respect to 2 items on your agenda, the Community Benefits Charge Bylaw and the Parkland Dedication Bylaw. So I'll be speaking again later. This time now, I'm only speaking with respect to the Community Benefits Charge Bylaw. Build, as some of you may know, has over 1,300 members representing a broad range of the industry and is the voice for the industry. And Build certainly appreciates the time that staff and the external consultant have spent with Build to date, consulting on both the CBC bylaw and the Parkland matter. During those meetings, Build, including myself and its consulting team, shared its concerns with the CBC and Parkland bylaw matter, but also shared potential solutions. And it was only this month, however, that the town released the draft CBC bylaw. So this is Build's first opportunity to express its position on the bylaw. Build does not support the CBC bylaw as currently drafted, or the Parkland Dedication bylaw as currently drafted. And Build looks forward, however, to continuing to work with staff to resolve its concerns. I want to be very clear. Build's goal is to reach a consensus with staff on both bylaws by the time they come forward for adoption, which I anticipate is next month. So now I just want to concentrate on the time remaining on the community benefits charge bylaw. Build is not concerned with the 4% rate. Rather, it's concerned with how it will be applied in very specific situations where there are pre-existing buildings or structures on the land, and which pre-existing buildings or structures remain on the land after redevelopment. And I'm going to give you some examples. But to summarize, Build's concern is that the current draft of the CBC bylaw would essentially apply that 4% rate against those pre-existing buildings. And that would artificially, and in our opinion, improperly, increase the charge. Let me explain what I mean by the way of two examples. In the first example, you have a pre-existing 5-story, 25-unit residential building. And that 5-story, 25-unit residential building is going to remain, and the redevelopment seeks to add 5 more stories and 25 more units. So you start with 5 and 25, and you add another 5 and 25. Post redevelopment, then, you have 10 stories with 50 residential units. The way the CBC bylaw is currently drafted, it would apply 4% of the value of the land post redevelopment. That's 4% of a piece of land with a building that has 10 stories and 50 units. That 4% will be much more than should be applied. It should be 4% only against the new development, or 4% on essentially half of the new value. It would be improper to essentially apply a 4% charge against existing units and an existing building. I'm going to use another example that has a non-residential component, example number 2. Imagine now, instead of a 5-story building, you have an existing 2-story non-residential building. Maybe there's retail at the bottom and some office space on top, and the developer proposes to add to that 2-story building 5 more stories with 25 residential units. Like the last example, Build's position is that the 4% charge should only apply to the additional 5 stories and the additional 25 units, and not be applied against the value added to the land of the original 2-story building. Now, I appreciate that these examples may be something that the town hasn't experienced yet and may not experience for some time, but this CBC bylaw may be in place for quite a while, and the only thing that council may seek to change on it in the future is the rate, leaving all other provisions the way they are. I think it would be best if we could get it right now. And so Build's recommendation is that the bylaw be revised to specifically exclude from the value of the land all pre-existing buildings and structures which remain post redevelopment. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. Those are Bill's submissions on the CBC bylaw.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kagan, for the time that you took to bring that to us. So council, that's the end of the delegations that I'm aware of, and that brings us to decision time. And the indicated motion is that the information be received. And as you know, this is not the approval session. This is the, send it back for final work. And the first hand up was Councillor Elgar, and I'll accept his motion. Is there any objection to Councillor Elgar's motion? There being none, that carries. Thank you, Councillor Elgar. And just for clarity, the rest of the motion is that the final thing come back to the September 6th Planning and Development Council meeting for adoption. So, and if passed, the bylaw would come into force on September 7th. And there's a nice point here, which is we need to have it adopted before September 9th, or we don't have any way to collect any money. So that's the timetable we're on. Council, we now turn to 9.2, the Parks and Open Space Strategy. And here we have a much longer list of registered delegations. And we have staff available. Matt Day, the Manager of Development, Financing and Investments, Chris Mark, the Director of Parks and Open Space, and Gabe Charles, the Director of Planning Services. And Mr. Charles is standing in the aisle, and I'm going to call on him to set this up for us. And after you're done, or you could wait till after the delegations if you want, as you sometimes do. Mr. Charles.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And as Mr. Scanlon was referring to, this is the third of the growth funding tools that Council can utilize. And our consultant, Ron Palmer from the Planning Partnership, will provide a high-level overview of where we are with the Parks Plan 2031, as well as the draft Parkland Dedication bylaw. And following the delegation, staff and Mr. Palmer will be available for questions.
All right, so Mr. Palmer?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Gabe, I'm hoping we can put the PowerPoint up on the screen. Excellent. I'm going to begin with a statement that absolutely this is still a work in progress, and very interesting to hear Mr. Scanlon's overview of the CBC work, and to let council know that we have met with Mr. Scanlon on a number of occasions throughout the preparation of our work, with the goal that we are highly coordinated in all three of those important tools to generate funding related to growth. Next slide, please. Tonight, I'm going to give you a very high-level overview, really about what we've done since the last time I spoke to you. A bit of a brief update on why we're doing this and what the underlying goals are, and then where we're going after tonight. Next slide, please. We began this project, a parks plan, with a number of goals in mind. We want to make sure that we're providing the town of Oakville with a comprehensive document that talks about multiple aspects related to parkland, including parkland dedication. But we do talk about a whole host of other elements, including the parkland hierarchy and other administrative elements that are important for the town of Oakville going forward. We have researched and looked at best practices from other jurisdictions. We want to make sure that we're responsive to the needs of growing Oakville. There is tremendous growth anticipated here, and parkland is a key element of your town. We also want to make sure that we're including some flexibility to look at different types of parks, different locations, different scales and design contexts within which some of those parks may be located. Next slide, please. First, there's a reason we're here, and that is related to provincial legislation. Starting with Bill 73, That changed the Planning Act, and it required that all municipalities in Ontario prepare a parks plan that justify the use of parkland dedication rates in your bylaw. It also capped cash in lieu to 1 hectare per 500, which is a little less than half of the land requirement potential of 1 hectare per 300 dwelling units. Bill 197, which came out in 2020, talks about the fact that your bylaw can now be appealed in its total context to the Ontario Land Tribunal, and that there is a deadline if you wish to continue to utilize the alternative parkland dedication rates for residential development. That deadline is rapidly approaching at September 18th of 2022. A subsequent piece of legislation has come out, Bill 109. With respect to parkland, it really only applies to transit-oriented communities. At this point, notwithstanding that there's a Transit-Oriented Communities Act, does not appear to apply to Oakville at this time, although we're still awaiting direction from the province as to what applies and what does not apply. Next slide, please. As you're all aware, we had a presentation and a very good discussion with you on June 14th. There were a number of issues raised and questions asked that were great and will help us refine the parks plan and the parkland dedication bylaw. One of the key issues was how do we articulate and what is the role of council in the administration of the parkland dedication bylaw? What flexibility do you have to make decisions about parkland dedication? In July, on July 15th, we had a presentation and discussion with the development community. Again, lots of good questions, lots of ideas for refinements. Fundamentally, however, the key issue was about the metric for parkland dedication in the strategic growth areas, particularly where we have identified a per unit parkland dedication fee of $22,269 per unit. Subsequent to that meeting, we have received correspondence from a number of developers within the town of Oakville, reiterating the concern about the quantum of that metric, as well as a host of other issues. We expect that all of the comments raised both by council and by the development community will be reviewed in detail and responded to. In addition to the development community and council, we are also receiving comments from other stakeholders and members of the public. They too will be reviewed and responded to at the appropriate time. Next slide. You have before you the first draft of the Parkland Dedication Bylaw. It's a high-level bylaw that includes a number of key elements, including how the conveyance of parkland is to be calculated, how credits are to be dealt with, how to deal with payment in lieu of land, and how land value is, when particularly land value is established, and then a number of administrative details that are important for the bylaw. Next slide. Our next steps, of course, are to continue to receive commentary, review those comments, make appropriate adjustments and changes to the parks plan and parkland dedication bylaw, present the final versions of the parks plan and final parkland dedication bylaw at a public meeting, and then to come back to council with the final documents requesting adoption of the parkland dedication bylaw on September 6th. That's the same as the date identified by Mr. Scanlon. You're going to be very busy that night with very important topics. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, or we can hold that until after the delegations, but whatever you'd like me to do.
Thank you very much, Mr. Palmer. Council, is it your pleasure to return to Mr. Palmer after we've heard from the delegations? Okay, I read you that way. Then, Madam Clerk, would you call the delegations? It looks like the first one is our friend, Mr. Kagan, and I guess he's going to say what he promised to say. Mr. Kagan?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. It takes just a bit of time to rejoin as a panelist. I want to make it clear that Bill agrees that parks are important and essential to creating complete communities. There's no debate there. And Bill members are proud to have partnered with the town in the past in delivering high quality parks for its residents, and we intend to continue to do so well into the future. The GTA is growing, and we all need collectively to find the best way to accommodate that growth while ensuring that residents have access to the parkland, open space, and recreational facilities that they need. Land is growing scarce and becoming more expensive. And thus we all need to be more efficient and learn how to do more with less. This is the key theme in what Bill wants to say tonight. We have to find a way to do more with less because we're running out of space. My Bill's first recommendation is that there be a percentage cap for land dedication. The reason for that is that applying a maximum alternative parkland dedication rate, which I acknowledge is permitted by the Act, is simply not sustainable. That maximum rate is a provincial-wide rate. What might work in one part of the province might not work in Oakville. Applying the maximum rate is not only not sustainable, but it will have a detrimental impact on intensification and housing affordability. Without a percentage cap, the amount of parkland dedication can easily amount to most, sometimes more, than the entire site. Either way, this essentially sterilizes the site for intensification. And that is why Bill's most important recommendation is a percentage cap. You would not be the first to do this. Other municipalities have done it. They still do it, and they're proposing to do it. And that list includes municipalities in the GTA, like Toronto, Brampton, Richmond Hill, and Halton Hills, and ones further afield, like Guelph. Now, in terms of the proposed per unit fixed rate, Bill only just received the figures. We're studying them. We'll provide comments on them later. I mentioned that we have to learn how to do more with less. I have some concrete examples of how the town can do that. And it starts by understanding that parkland and open space is far more than just baseball diamonds, soccer pitches, and splash pads. More and more people today desire trails for walking, running, and cycling. I think the town knows this best of all. You have some of the most incredible biking trails in the GTA. And I think some of you will agree that the best of these trails is not located on open, flat areas surrounded by houses, but are instead located in woodlands, valleys, and otherwise undeveloped or undevelopable areas. The town should accept all these as parkland dedication and provide 100% credit against it. If the land can be used for some type of meaningful open space or recreational purpose, there's no good reason not to give 100% parkland credit. And that credit should be made explicit in the bylaw. And I would like the town to use as an example the Parkland Dedication bylaw passed by the City of Vaughan on June 28th. And I know that your staff and consultants are aware of it. Here's another example of how you can do more with less. We call these dual use lands. You have an underground stormwater management tank, and above it, you have a park. Both the stormwater tank and the park component are owned by the municipality. Obviously, the underground stormwater tank has to be properly engineered and provide good quality stormwater management. And obviously, the park atop has to be properly designed and provide good quality open space. The members of the public who use the park probably don't even know that there's a stormwater tank below. And if they do know, they probably don't care. There should be 100% credit given in a case like that. Here's another example of doing more with less. Strata Parks and POPs. So a strata park is where the town owns the park above, and there's a private ownership and use below, usually underground parking. Most people don't know that below the park is underground parking, and they probably don't care. In the case of Nathan Phillips Square, for example, the park sits above one of the largest underground parking lots in all of Toronto, and that above ground park and open space is one of the most popular and used recreational spaces in the city. A POPs, on the other hand, is where a condo corporation owns the surface, but there is a legally perpetual binding easement in favor of the town, allowing the public free use of the open space. In some ways, the POPs is the best of both worlds because the public gets to use it, but doesn't have to ever pay for it through taxes. Both of these should be provided 100% parkland credit explicitly in the bylaw. Another example of doing more with less are what we call pocket parks or sliver parks or linear parks. They're quite small open spaces. They are not large enough to be programmed in any way, but they are important in highly urbanized areas. They are something the developers are often asked to provide. If they're important enough to warrant asking them to be provided, they're important enough to warrant a full parkland credit. Last thing I want to deal with is a section of the bylaw that states that the decision of whether or not to take land or cash in lieu, and if there's a combination, what the percentages should be, is in the sole discretion of the town. And then that power is delegated to the director of planning. Now, Build has no issue with the delegation to the director of planning because town council reserves the right to take that power back if it's ever appropriate. But the provision that says that that choice is solely in the discretion of the town is, with respect, not consistent with the law in Ontario. There have been several cases decided by the Ontario Land Tribunal or its predecessors, LPAT and the OMB, where the tribunal decided debates between a municipality and a developer respecting the question of land versus cash in lieu. And even where both parties agreed it should be land, but disagreed on where and how much, the tribunal decided those debates as well. Of course, the town can and should always state its preference. But that's where it ends. The law doesn't support it being exclusively their decision. Mr. Mayor, members of council, those are my submissions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kagan, for the many ways you've thought of for us to improve the profit margins of the development industry. And we'll certainly give them the consideration they're due. Councillor Elgar, did you want questions now?
I was just going to ask Mr. Kagan if he could provide us with a few examples that he just mentioned at the very end, specific cases.
The cases. I'm sure he will generously provide every single one of them. I've known Ira for a long time.
And so have I.
I would be happy to send them all to your solicitor. If he could just send me, he or she could just send me an email, I'd be pleased to do so. I've got them all in a single file anticipating a question just like this, Councillor Elgar.
On their way. Thank you, Councillor
On their
Elgar.
way.
Thank you.
Anything else, Councillor Elgar? Councillor Robertson then.
Hi, my questions go to the suggestion about the reservoirs, or like the burying the wet reservoirs for stormwater, or the underground parking. The costs of both of those would be exorbitant in comparison to what we have for above ground parking. if we don't have specific parkland dedication fees, how would we ever pay for something like that?
It's a good question, Council Robertson. The underground parking is actually privately owned by the condominium corporation, so it has to maintain that parking at its own expense at all time. But the municipality would get ownership of the surface, and it's not just a few inches, it's many feet thick so that you can put in services and trees can thrive. So that would be maintained at the taxpayer's expense the way any publicly owned park is. But if I can dig just a little bit deeper into your question, what some municipalities are concerned about is what happens to the park if the underground parking garage needs to be fixed one day? Do you have to rip up the park? And how terrible would that be and who pays for it? That does sometimes happen about once every 50 years. So while it is an expense, it's not such a large expense that the municipality should say, we don't want to do more with less and give credits for what we call dual use facilities or strata parks. There's two examples and we can deal with both. Now, where we have the underground storage tank, which is owned by the municipality, these have been used in many, many locations throughout North America. They're starting to be used more often in the GTA, and they're designed to last about 100 years. Everything breaks, but they're designed to last about 100 years. And the conservation authorities have been looking at these underground tanks, and they found that they actually provide some environmental benefits because the water in this underground storm pond, if you want to call it, is kept at a much cooler temperature than a surface pond. And when it's released into the rivers and streams, it's better for that ecology.
I'm not necessarily arguing because I actually think they're both great answers. I'm just asking about the paying for it. Because we get back to the same thing. Should taxpayers assume costs, even though you say that they're, well, in the case of the stormwater, it won't be private. In the case of a parking garage, but then that's not a very big green space. If I look at the underground being built right now in my ward for, you know, multiple story condos or apartment buildings, it would be very, very little green space for a park.
So if it's very little green space, then the developer gets a very little credit, but he still gets a credit. And if the municipality in its wisdom thought that the balance of the parkland should be provided as regular dirt, then it would be. And if the municipality decided in its wisdom that the balance of the parkland obligation be satisfied by cash in lieu, then it would be. We're not asking for a deal. We're asking for a credit to recognize that even if there's parking below the surface of the strata park, the public can still use the strata park and it serves its purpose.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Councillor Robertson. Thank you, Mr. Kagan, for your explanations. Madam Clerk, would you call the next delegation?
Yes, the next delegation is Chris Kowalchuk.
Mr. Kowalchuk, welcome.
Mayor Burton and Council. Through you.
Welcome back to in-person council meetings.
Good to see everybody. I was coming to speak primarily to the Parks and Open Space Plan regarding, it was more about curb cuts and crosswalks, because as a recently retired guy, as Mr. Keegan pointed out, we have such an extensive trail system for biking, whatnot. And the further north you go, the more planned it was. I was talking with Chris Marks about this. The better it is because it was planned. And of course, I live in the Kerr Village area. And I've noticed, so specifically the point I was talking about is a prime example is at Fourth Line when you do the Indian Trail across. You get to Fourth Line and now there's no crosswalk, there's no curb cut for accessibility for, you know, someone in a wheelchair or an old guy in an old mountain bike without springy shocks. And you have to go up to a driveway and down, and there's just absolutely no crosswalk there. And that's at most trailheads where they cross. That's specific to most of them. There's kind of the trail just ends, there's a sidewalk, there's the boulevard, there's a curb. Sometimes there's the yellow, the bike bars in at the stop. So I know the plan is, and it's about money and having it going forward for continuity so that it makes it useful. Again, that Indian Trail, it stops dead at third line. And I know the plan is eventually with time and money to move it forward. And again, there's the connector when you go underneath the bridge at 6th line, underneath the QE, and you come out. Now you've got to go on Leyland or the North Service Road to get to the trailhead at Iroquois Ridge at Trafalgar Road. So there's, the gaps, and I know the plan is eventually to fill it up. And there's one, and it's in the Glen Abbey Trail, and you come up to the trail, and then you've got to go about 10 meters to the right where the crosswalk is, and then come back. But the trail goes here and here. And I mean, I just know from experience, everybody crossed there. It's like, when you have a field and you make the path around here and everyone walks diagonally across because that's where they're inclined to go. So park staff, when they're planning it, plan for the eventualities of what people actually do. But I thought I was going to be able to speak to all the agenda items here. So to the Ira Keegan's point about, I would love to see Build learn to do more with less. They're really good at everyone else learning to do more with less, and I think they would be that way too. For example, I noticed in the presentation in regards that there was, it was 4% is the max, but it might be 2, 3, whatever, because there's a meeting in 2 weeks with the development community and they're not obligated to have public consultation. Well, you've already shown by your own numbers, we're already 1% short and we're going to be subsidizing new development. And I remember 10 years ago going to a meeting at the region regarding development charges, and it's like when you have a bad benefit plan and your dentist charges today's rates, but you have a 1972 fee schedule. And my concern is that the existing tax base is already on development charges, already subsidizing new developments. And now here's another percentage point, that we're funding new developments. And also around the CBC charges, I remember when the Rain was built, I'd call in Kathy Duddick and saying, well, where did that money go? Like, where was it spent? And it's interesting to see now how under the new regime, it's going to go into the general coffer. And I think it's very important to the taxpayer that it's a transparent when that money comes with a specific development and what it's specifically spent on, and that it's in your local community around where that money, that development charge is for that specific development. I mean, so I had to call Kathy and say, where was the money spent? And it was on amenities at the Oakville Arena from the Rain, in the same neighborhood. So as a taxpayer, I look at it and I go, we want to see that community benefit in where the disruption and where that happens. And as well, in the Parkland dedication, I'd really like to see town council, everything, close the loopholes around, for example, I know on the waterfront, when someone wants to tear something down and build, they have to make Parkland dedication along the lake. And then there was the old Chester Hall workaround where we didn't think about someone amassing 5 lots, and then they were able to create this land block of that waterfront trail. Because, I mean, that's one thing I've noticed, again, riding my bike around. There's all these beautiful little parkettes, but they're completely inaccessible. For example, at the back of the Sharkies, the 11 Forsyth, there was a big stink about getting a Parkland dedication, and then we got that waterfront on the water, and they used to have a lovely gazebo there, but I guess somebody complained, and now it's basically become a little dead-end thing, and most people, there's a sign that doesn't say, and it just goes to a little dead-end nothing there, and it's, sure, we got a Parkland dedication, but it's ostensibly become unusable public space that no one even really knows about, and I don't know if during the harbor redevelopment it's going to be enclosed, is included in part of it, but basically, that I was really, like I said, coming up here to talk about curb cuts and continuity and making the bike system actually work so there's north and south connectors. Because it's, I live on Kerr Street, I got to go, under the tracks, under the QE at Kerr Street or over the thing at Dorval. And I know we're kind of limited as what we can do, but so that there are actually physical bike path connections that are separated from the road. Because I know a lot of people won't ride on the road. And as lovely as those bike paths are on Spears, I hate to say it, but most of the people who are going to work at those businesses on Spears can't afford to live in Oakville, so they're not riding their bike. There may be some who ride their bikes from the Kerr Street community or other places in town where there's an element of affordable housing. So it's lovely to have them there, and I wish those guys who ride on the Pelotons on the weekends would go up to Spears because it's beautiful and no one's on the road. But it's a shame that I think for the bike infrastructure, it was a noble idea to put it there, but I think the money could have been better spent trying to make the off-trail connectors that are separated, absolutely from traffic that would get used more, because as you know, our demographic is people like myself and older and out walking and doing the trails. I mean, our demographic, young people can use them as well, but I can tell you just from as a user, it's mostly out people of, age walking out. There are some other groups and some kids, but for the most part, when I see the trails day in, day out, it's, an older clientele using it for walking or riding their bikes. And the current system, I know the plan is to hook it all up, but currently, there's no north-south on the east end up the Morrison Valley and that. So when you're riding a bike and you want to get from one end of town to the other, you kind of have to, almost go into harm's way at some points or go out of your way to cross at a controlled crossing. There's my 2 cents. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kowalczyk, for your many fine points, far more than 2 cents.
Thanks.
Madam Clerk, the next delegation, please.
The next delegation is Wanda Critchen.
Ms. Crichton,
Crichton,
I think
sorry.
I'm saying it correctly. Welcome.
Yeah,
Council.
good evening. I did have a slideshow, but I'm not going to use it. I'm going to take a piece from my colleague, fellow citizen here.
Okay.
My comments are really in the material you received already with this agenda. But one thing I would like to say is, first of all, it's great to be here. Mayor Burton, councillors, planning staff, ladies and gentlemen. Having this type of opportunity in person as well as virtual is definitely the way I think we need to move forward. Before I actually comment on the parks plan itself, I want to talk about the consultation process. With all due respect, I'm very concerned about what I believe and experience as a systemic inequity when it comes to the public consultation process in Oakville for something as important as this, as the master plan. Parks are the lifeblood of our community. They're integral to the quality of life for residents. And the notice that went out inviting public input, when it went out, I got it on the town's e-newsletter. It pointed you to a 200-page document and a 2-hour council meeting recording in the middle of the summer, asking for people to respond to be at this meeting by the 15th of July or August 9th. When I complained about the fact there was no executive summary, nothing, there was a brief change made adding, there's a video available on the council meeting. That was it. Respectfully, absolutely no public information session was held for something as important as parks prior to today. Just before coming here, I went to and printed the page of what the steps are that is on the public website as of 3 o'clock this afternoon. It talked about the July 2022 public consultation. It jumps to today's meeting, and then it says September the 6th, Planning and Development Council. Now, this evening, Mr. Charles presented that there will now be a public meeting, information meeting. I submit that's a good step, but it's way too late. And this is my whole point. We heard Mr. Keegan, he's had many meetings and contacts on this. We're the citizens who live here and use the parks, and no one had the courtesy to conduct a public information session for us. As council, I think that as citizens, we are owed much more in terms of hearing what it is we have to say. I'm also appalled at the report itself in some respects, because the examples that are used and were referenced talk about New York, Boston, Chicago. Okay, what's also missing in those reports is the fact that New York has Central Park. Boston has the Common. Chicago has Grant Park, Navy Pier. The population in those areas, they also all have robust public transit. Well, we don't have any of that in Oakville. I'm scared to find out how much we paid for a report that doesn't even have any examples that are Canadian or cities our size. So I'm just leaving those comments with you, and I hope we can expect better from our council in actually engaging citizens in a meaningful way, and not just, oh, the Planning Act says this, tick box, will do the minimum. I respectfully ask you to consider that. As far as the plan itself, it's inequitable. We have taxpayers all paying the same rate of taxes, and yet they're going to receive less amenities. They're not going to have ready access to parks. They're not going to, they already are inundated with traffic. They don't have infrastructure ready for them. They don't have adequate parking. As far as I'm concerned, it's a reflection of poor planning. This master parks plan should have been prepared and ready when you were authorizing all of this development that's now underway. So I think it's a little late. I'm glad the province is prodding us to do it. So what I think is wrong with it is that I agree that land is scarce and that people will have to travel for things like a big ballpark or a soccer field. They shouldn't, however, have to travel just to get a basic bench. The report that I'm talking about and my presentation talks about is the 200-page report, which is all I had access to until most recently when the slideshow for the developer was posted. So the pages 28 to 31 in those recommendations basically says that in the SGAs, you're going to have concrete, period. You're going to have sliver parks. You're going to have maybe an urban square if you're lucky. Well, I contend that that's not good enough. They claim in the report that, oh, it's an urban lifestyle choice that people are making to live in an area like that. I contend that's true for some, but for the vast majority of people, I think it's born of necessity. We all talked about the cost of housing here. It's the only kind of housing that's being built. We're going to have families in there. This report doesn't address the needs of families with children that are going to be living in those areas. With respect to what is needed, I think what we need is a bylaw that confirms, in fact, there is a mandatory amount of actual green space. You declared a climate emergency in this town. This bylaw should direct climate mitigation strategies and entrench that in terms of making your new parkland. It shouldn't be all concrete. All you're doing is increasing the heat islands that you're doing by putting all concrete in these SGAs. I also think that cash in lieu should be the exception, not the rule. The bylaw should direct cash in lieu taken from the SGAs be returned to park and rec facilities within the boundaries of the SGAs or immediately adjacent. These funds should not be reallocated and redirected to other areas of town that are already adequately serviced. That is just patently unfair. Full transparency, including separate accounting to show how these funds are spent and where, should be mandated in the bylaw. Decisions, and I disagree with Mr. Keegan on a number of his points, decisions on cash in lieu or some combination should only be made by elected town council. Delegation for large decisions should not be delegated to unelected staff. That should not occur. This is a function that council should not delegate because it's the future of our community and of our children. There also should be no exemptions awarded to developers to reduce the requirement for provision of parkland as defined in the bylaw and as referred to by Mr. Keegan. We're already subsidizing his development fees. I'm tired of it. I don't want to do it anymore. So what could we do? He talks about doing more with less. How about we do more with what we have? How about putting, for example, a minimum tree canopy in all the park types? We need that desperately for climate change mitigation. The town should also hang on to a good portion of the town they actually own now, particularly in the SGA's areas, as a cost-free way of starting the proposed land bank they were talking about. You're not going to spend any money for land you already own. So it would be cheaper to do that than buy new land, which is what's being contemplated in part of the report. Also, parks should be public, period. With respect to Mr. Keegan's comments, who enforces compliance and public access rights to POPs and strata? Getting back to the repair and replacement costs, what happens when there's a dispute? What happens when the company goes bankrupt? Private parks, I have no objection to. They can be additional, but they should not replace what is mandated public space. We also need meaningful consultation on the design of parks and really meaningfully involve the public. We could make better use of our existing parks, reducing the need for people to burn fuel by driving all over town for half an hour to get to a soccer field. The decision to limit sprawl in Halton should have consequences for everyone, not just further increasing the density in SGAs. There should be more missing middle. You could do better with the parks you have. I have 5 seconds left. I just request that I could respond to Mr. Keegan's other points. We are subsidizing you already. The land trails that he's proposing be counted doesn't take into consideration disabled people. So when he was talking about using the woods and the nature land, dual use, don't even talk about storage tanks and using grass on top. I don't think we should be using storage tanks in residential areas at all. I've delegated on that. I've talked to you about why I don't think we should be going with a private park public model. And with respect, I really think you need to think about carefully what you are doing, because the developers and his contention that it goes to the OLT, everything goes to the OLT. So there's no need not to take hold of the power you can have and say we want final say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Crichton. And I think you made good use of the latitude that we gave you with extra time. Thank you for that. Madam Clerk, would you call the next registered delegation?
The next registered delegation is Calvin Lance from Stegman Elliott and representing District Developments.
Mr. Lance, welcome. Council looks forward to your information.
Your Worship and members of Council. I'm a lawyer at Stegman Elliott and I represent District Development. Now, District has multiple land holdings in major transit station areas in Oakville as identified by the region. And they're specifically in locations encouraged for high density development as noted in our letter that we submitted to the town yesterday. Now I'm here to express concern with the proposed park plan and draft bylaw along the lines that was articulated earlier by Mr. Kagan. And I'd like to ask staff to specifically direct, or ask council rather, to specifically ask staff to meet with district and report back on the issues that were raised by Mr. Kagan and which I'm going to raise here. We would like to have a meeting with staff to discuss our concerns. Now, while the staff report accompanying this item speaks to consultation that has taken place, district was neither included or invited to participate. I don't know the reasons why, but it's unfortunate given the extent of their land holdings in these areas around the GHOST train station and areas where intensification is to occur. And I'm pleased to hear that Mr. Palmer said that it's an ongoing process and they're still working on the bylaw and working towards that September date. So what I'm hoping is that staff will take the time to meet with our client and to explore the concerns and some solutions. The park plan and the draft bylaw in its current form will act as a barrier, a significant barrier to the delivery of residential intensification in Oakville. Now, by way of illustration, District has made an application on Cross Street across from the GO train station And they're proposing 1,750 residential units. And if you apply the proposed bylaw to that, it would require the conveyance of 3.5 hectares of land as a park. 3.5 hectares of land is larger than our site. And on the other hand, if cash in lieu is required at $22,260 per unit, then we are approaching a payment of approximately $40 million to the town. That's more than the land is worth. So something appears to be wrong here when applying this new bylaw and plan to a high-density residential development. I'm not here to say that the bylaw doesn't work for low-rise or the missing middle, but when it comes to a large site, something seems to fall out of the equation. So more work needs to be done. And I think we should be able to reach a robust parkland policy and bylaw that allows the town to get the parkland or the cash in lieu that they're looking for without unintendedly precluding the delivery of high-density developments in the locations where you want to have them. And I'm sure I don't need to remind council, I'm sure all council members here are aware that if intensification doesn't occur in these strategic growth areas in Oakville, such as across the street from a GO train station, then the housing targets won't be met, which will mean that there'll be increased pressure for development in other areas of the city where you don't want it to occur. And you're going to have or encourage the province to step in. So the good news here is we still have time. It's the beginning of August. We're not in September yet. Our client's willing to meet with staff and go over the formula and look at how the parkland can be delivered, the cash in lieu could be delivered, and the much-needed housing. But the reality is, if there's a barrier to density, a barrier to high-density developments, you won't have the development, you won't have the parkland. And then the province will raise an eyebrow. So in the meeting that we're hoping to have with staff, from our client's perspective, and this falls along the lines of what Mr. Kagan was speaking to, we need to revisit the base parkland target rate of 2.2 hectares per thousand residential, or per thousand residents, but we need to look at that relative to the intensification policies. Like, how does this actually work when you're dealing with a large intensification proposal? And the rate of 2.2 hectares per thousand residents was established in 1999. That's 22 years ago, and it was established at a time when the policies for intensification do not look like they do today. The other area that needs to be looked at is reducing the cash in lieu rate and providing a cap, and Mr. Kagan also spoke to that. The point here is we're not going to meet the provincial targets, and I'm not going to get into the implications of that, but it is inviting the province to get involved if the town of Oakville doesn't get this right. I think there's also an opportunity here to look at Parkland Credits for POPs. We've heard about privately owned, publicly accessible spaces. Those are governed by easements. They're controlled by the town then. Or stratified parks, where the stratified park is owned. It's not a private park. It's owned by the town, controlled by the town. It just happens to be located over a parking garage or some other infrastructure. It goes to the theme of making more use of limited resources. And then we need to look at credits for off-site park dedications, which can be extremely valuable to encourage development and to augment some other park with neighboring lands. It's done in Toronto. There should be some form of credit for that. That we could have a creative solution here. We have to look creatively to come up with something that encourages development. We cannot have the Parkland Bylaw as the tail wagging the dog of development. They have to work together. So on behalf of District, I respectfully request that this council direct staff to meet with the development industry, with our clients specifically, and report back in September. And I would also encourage both staff and council to look at the developer as a partner, and that with the town's help, we can deliver parkland and the housing intensification that is needed, and we can do it in a timely way. Thank you.
Mr. Lance, I'd like to detain you for a brief suggestion. First, I'm not going to support, and I don't believe anyone on council will direct staff to meet with anybody, staff having just told everybody that they're going to meet with everybody, tout le monde, the public, and the public includes you. That's actually well established by your profession. So you're asking us to do the unnecessary. We're not interested in that. If you want to make your time count in the limited amount of time left, when I was in business, I would expect you to bring a detailed, calculated proposal and to demonstrate how it would affect your pro formas for your development projects. And that would assist us, because otherwise we're having our land economists second guess your claims, and it would be a much more partner-like process if you opened the kimono and demonstrated the difficulty that you say is there. Okay. So I would just leave that with you as a friendly suggestion. If you want to progress your ideas, you're going to have to write them down and prove them and submit them.
And that is exactly why we want to have the meeting.
Okay, well, send the papers first so you can have a useful meeting about the submission is the business principle that I'm trying to get at here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Madam Clerk, the next delegation, please.
The next delegation is Emma West, representing Northbridge Capital, Inc.
Ms. West, council looks forward to your information. I don't see her, but, oh, there, she's starting to appear. Welcome, Ms. West.
Sorry about that. It just takes a moment to get.
And I should say welcome back, because we've met with you before, and it's delightful to see you.
Yes, that's correct. So good evening, everyone. I am Emma West, a planner and partner at Bouse Fields. And as mentioned, I'm here on behalf of Northbridge Capital. We have been here speaking to you on behalf of Northbridge Capital in the past related to the Brawny Go study. And tonight we are here to talk about the Parkland dedication. You will have received a letter that we submitted on July 15th in the agenda package. And in that, we note that there are recommendations that we support, and certainly there is a need for parkland. There's just a couple of issues that I want to bring to your attention right now, and that are also addressed in the letter. So those are two issues related to a cap on the parkland dedication requirement for higher density development. You've heard that mentioned by a couple of the previous speakers. And I also want to talk about the integration of the parks plan with a comprehensive planning process like the Brawny Go study. So I'll just take a bit of time to touch on those topics. Related to the cap, similar to the other speakers, we request that the requirements for parkland dedication, particularly in the strategic growth areas, be appropriately limited for mid-rise and high-rise type development, so that projects of that nature are not unduly impacted by the requirements. Our request aligns with some of the comments in the town's own consultants' background reports that were prepared in the documents provided in June or July. In one of the appendices of the draft parks plan, there was mention of the significant financial impact of the application of an alternative rate on higher density residential development projects. And it was also acknowledged in that same report that applying the alternative rate can often result in a parkland land area that is greater than the development site itself, or a cash in lieu payment that is greater than the value of the development site. So we've also looked into that just at a high level and in terms of a calculation, and we've done some analysis based on what has been approved in the council adopted official plan amendment 41, which is the Brawny GO Station study. I know you're waiting for approval from the region on that one, but it is an OPA that was adopted by this council that allowed for high density development on Northbridge's site, which is abutting the current Brawny GO Station lands. And so we did some math based on the density that would be allowed through that Brawny GO Station study, or OPA 41, to figure out how many units you might get on the Northbridge lands. And what we figured out was similar to the other speakers, that the amount of parkland that would be required if it was based on land would be twice the area of the site itself. And also that the cash in lieu value would be greater than the value of the lands. So without a cap or a graduated approach to the application of parkland dedication requirements, sites like the Northbridge site, which is a part of the Brawny GO Station area, part of an MTSA, and directly adjacent to the station lands themselves, would be impacted by these requirements without a cap or a graduated approach. So we're requesting that the town introduce a cap or a graduated approach to the amount of parkland for mid-rise and high-rise development, particularly in strategic growth areas. And as you've heard, that's not uncommon across the region to approach that sort of intensification and parkland dedication in that way. My second point is related to the Brawny GO Station study itself and the direction that that provides, and the need for compatibility between your parkland plan and bylaw and a comprehensive plan such as that. So there's consideration in the staff report that you have this evening for the master parks agreement for North Oakville, but not the same consideration for other comprehensively planned areas like the Brawny GO Station study. And the Brawny GO Station study and OPA, you'll recall, identified specific areas for parkland, as well as an area for parkland for the Brawny GO Station area. And that was through your comprehensive planning process with community input and resulted in that council adopted OPA. So this approach means in the Brawny GO Station area, there are some properties in the plan area that will have parkland on them and others that will not. And the policies that are in the adopted OPA 41 direct that the approximate location of those parks or open space areas should be provided generally in accordance with the schedules of the official plan amendment. And the policies provide that there's a total land area requirement of 14 hectares. So there was a lot of thinking and consultation done to prepare those policies and to bring them to council for you to adopt them. However, the parkland plan doesn't take into account that you've already done that comprehensive thinking for the area. So we're suggesting that there be some consideration for that, where you have areas in the town that you've already thought through where you want parkland and how much you want, and that be reflected in your approach to parkland dedication, because that official plan amendment for the Brawny GO study area, OPA 41, didn't contemplate providing parks on a site-by-site basis. It was looking comprehensively at the entire plan area. So I'll just sum up to say that we look forward to working with town staff. We've communicated on a number of things with respect to Northbridge. Of course, most importantly, the Brawny GO study. We're supportive of many aspects of the parkland plan, but these are just two key issues that we wanted to put before you this evening. So thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight.
Thank you very much for your information. I would like to ask you if you noted the suggestions I made to Mr. Lance on behalf of his client. Would you and your client be able to provide us, meaning the town, with proof of the necessity of the remedy you're seeking by opening the kimono and producing the pro formas that would show that the project would not be viable at these stated rates? As you may surmise, we've engaged estimable, well-known, highly credentialed land economists who advise us differently than you advise. And in my business career, the solution is for people to put the numbers on the table rather than just talk about, well, it's more land than I want to give, or it's more land than my site. I'll just point out to you that our standard of 2.2 hectares per thousand, in the case of a building with 1,750 units, that I would, just for the sake of the example in the air, submit that that might be 3,500 people. And that'd be 3,500. And 3,500 thousands times 2.2 hectares per thousand would, I think, be something like 7.7 hectares of parkland for that many people. And if I follow your logic, 3,500 people are going to have next to no parkland. And so that's the difficulty. And that's why I think it's urgent that you demonstrate a financial necessity rather than just point with horror at how much the land is.
I'll certainly take that back. I obviously am not in communication at this exact moment with Northbridge, but they're certainly always open to coordinating with the town, and I can't speak for them at this moment, but we hear your comment and I'll do my best to take that back. I do just want to add again that it's a bit of a different situation with the Northbridge site because it's in the Bronte Go study area, and the town has already made some decisions about where parkland would be located. So again, I think there needs to be this integrated approach to, you've thought about where you're going to have parkland. And so assuming that it's going to be dedicated land on a site where you've already planned for parkland to be located elsewhere, I think that does need to be taken into account. But certainly I'll take back your comments. I think they're watching right now as well. And so we will talk about and get back to you as soon as possible. We're open to that meeting and we would come prepared. So I can't fully commit to it on their behalf, but I think they would be open to collaborating with the town.
I look forward to the response. I submitted the suggestion in all seriousness. I mean, we know you. You've worked for us, not just them. And we certainly know the quality and the standards that you work by. So we look forward to continuing the discussion. And thank you very much for the time you took to bring that to us today. That ends the Delegations Council. And pending your questions, we may be nearing a decision, which is not a very big one. We just have to receive it and send it on. The first hand I'll recognize is Councillor Chisholm, and after that, I think I saw Councillor Adams. Councillor Chisholm.
Thank you, Worship. Just a quick question and clarification from the consultant. The $22,269 assessment per unit, is that an average across the GTA? Is that within a standard that is acceptable with other municipalities in the GTA, or is it something that all over the map?
Mr. Palmer will supplement my answer. What we've heard tonight is that some municipalities have gone further and adopted caps, and the request to us is to follow that example. I've stated my reservations about that. Mr. Palmer, can you address Councillor Chisholm's question about what's normal?
Absolutely, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for the question. What's normal is not normal today. Everybody in the Greater Golden Horseshoe and in other parts of the province are doing the exact same study that you're doing right now. I am involved in a number of them, and the quantum varies from municipality to municipality, depending on a whole host of factors, including land values, development context, what you have in the bank in your Parkland Dedication account, and where you stand with your overarching parkland requirement per 1,000 people. However, I can tell you that the ones that I've been involved in are generally coming in with a per unit in strategic growth areas, somewhere in the neighborhood where you are. But absolutely, this is work that we're doing specific to the town of Oakville, based on the data and inventories that we have available to us. And as the mayor correctly pointed out, we do have financial experts testing the sensitivity of development pro formas with this number as well. It's not a done analysis yet. We expect there'll be some fine tuning. And there may be different directions depending on what council eventually wants to do. But our objective is to give you the number that delivers, in our estimation, your parkland system the best of our ability at 2.2 hectares per 1,000 people townwide.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Councillor Chisholm, is that good for you? Great, thanks. Councillor Adams and then Councillor Haslett-Deal.
Thanks very much. First of all, a comment and then a question for our staff to respond to. The first is I wanted to comment on some of the descriptions from some of the development community about the concern over the cost of land for parks. And Mayor Burton, I think you said it well. When you're adding thousands of additional people in a high-density area, you need the funding for providing parks in whatever form those parks are going to be. And so I don't agree with their desire to discount or cut off our ability to provide funding for our park system. The question I have for our staff is, with respect to the SGA areas and the park designs that we've done a whole bunch of work in the Midtown study work that includes concepts for parks. And I wonder if staff could provide a little bit of that and to us in terms of what they think that's going to look like. And the second part of my question is, we have a second stage that needs to come along, and it deals with the design of parks and what goes into these various parks that we're contemplating through this study. And I see in the comments from members of the public, both from tonight, but also in the online comments that we received, a number of items that make me believe that there's a disconnect in terms of people have specific desires about what goes into a park, whether it be splash pads, pickleball or tennis. There's a whole host of things that showed up in the comments that were part of the public materials tonight. And I think all of that detailed design work is next to come. And it also includes things like how much tree canopy is there within our parks? How do we include the tree canopy? Do we need to have, in the more urban dense areas, do they need to be in silvacells so that they survive? There's a whole bunch of work that needs to go in there. And there were some comments about how do we make sure that the parks are climate change friendly, I'll say. Could staff describe the next steps in the design process for each of these various areas?
Thank you, Councillor, and through you, Mr. Mayor. There was a lot to unpack there, so if I miss anything, please remind me. With respect to the planning and design that we have been doing for our SGAs, Brawny Go, Midtown, et cetera, yes, there's a key component of the land use fabric is the parkland. And that is necessary to have that complete community. What we have been working through is identifying how much land we may need for that, but we haven't yet been into the detail of what do those parks look like? What is the materials that we're using? How much green is in there? We haven't yet done that detail. That is work that will be coming somewhere in the future as we really try to identify what the facilities are that we need within that. And that really does flow out of, and as is detailed in the parks plan, the need to have a different type of parkland hierarchy in our SGAs compared to the suburban standard that we currently have, which is a great, robust system that we have. We refer to that as our campus of parks. And we now need to complement that in a different way, specifically within our SGAs. So will those look different? Absolutely, they'll be different. Are they going to be concrete? No, they're not all going to be concrete. There has to be elements of green infrastructure that will be part of that, and that does go through the design process, I'll say. If council recalls, in July, we were looking at that Midtown implementation piece. A key piece to that is going to be looking at that overall master planning exercise for the Parkland system throughout Midtown. So that still has to happen. With respect to inquiries from the public as it may relate to the splash pads, et cetera, the details of those facilities which go into our parks, that needs to be vetted through the Parks and Recreation Library Master Plan. And as council may be aware, that will be kicking off in the next few months. And that would provide that opportunity for the public to really provide the input to what kinds of splash pads are we looking for, how many cricket pitches, for example, those types of things which really provide that further detail for what goes into the various park areas. Does that assist, or did I miss anything?
I think that's an excellent clarification of what I describe as like a two-step process in terms of, first we need the land, and second we design what goes into that land more specifically. And both will have public consultation, and the second part, I think we'll have even more consultation, maybe I'm getting ahead of our process here, but the last time we went through the Parks and Rec and Library Master Plan, we had an awful lot of public input on that process because we have tons of user groups that have a great interest in getting access to facilities. When does that process start, and where will that show up in the public realm for members of our public to take part in that?
So if I may, I'll ask Mr. Mark to join me if he hasn't shown up just yet. And he can provide maybe a little bit more detail than I can in terms of how that could potentially look in that public consultation.
That's great, because I know we've got people from all kinds of different park areas wanting everything from a park bench, Mr. Mark, to a splash pad, so and everything else in between.
Through you, Mayor Burton, the Parks Rec Library Master Plan is going to be kicking off this fall. We'll be going out to solicit consultants in the next month, and we'll be doing that award likely in late September, early October. So we hope to start the public consultation this fall, and that will continue into the winter months with likely about probably Q2 draft report to come back to council in 2023.
Great, thank you very much. I very much appreciate staff giving some of that clarification.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Haslett-Deal, and then Councillor Grant and Giddings.
Thank you, Mayor Burton. Thank you to Councillor Adams for some of his questions. They took a few off my list. I want to start by saying I recognize that in this plan, I mean, a core part of it is ensuring that we are going to acquire the land we need to provide a safe, healthy, vibrant, livable community. And I'm very concerned to make sure that, as a couple people have stated tonight, that it really is not just adequate, but the right amount of green space, the right design that's going to ensure a really successful community in the SGAs. They are taking a huge amount of growth. And so what I loved about the report when I was reading it was that it talked about good insights into the benefits of parks from a physical and mental health and about building community. And it spent some time reflecting on the pride we should have in the park system we have. So I get concerned when I hear individuals potentially talking about reductions in our ability to hold to a standard that really is what makes the town livable. And sometimes in the language in the report, there's a bit of a thread there that makes an assumption that individuals may choose to live there, that being in that urban community is what they're all about. And yes, there is a piece of that, but in more instances, that's what's affordable for them. That's what's available for them. And in no document have I seen any evidence that they don't desire maximum green space, an active parkland, not just passive parkland. So I really appreciated all the delegations tonight because it really shows the different perspectives. I had an earlier conversation, Councillor Giddings and I, with Director Charles and Director Mark about a concern that the residents associations have not had the opportunity to really provide input. By the time this came out, several of them were knee-deep in other issues. We reached out to some of them around comments. They would appreciate, as one of the delegates tonight pointed out, the town hosting a public information for them. As I think Councillor Adams may have said, we've done an outstanding job with Parks, Recs, and Master Plans, but this is a foundational plan. And I'd ask staff to confirm for me, if this is approved as it stands in September, and I imagine there will be some adjustments, what flexibility do we have in terms of the types of parks, the hierarchy of parks, and some of the language that's in here that governs how parks will be funded or locations determined? Could staff perhaps answer that one for me?
I see no one else coming to the podium, so I will start. And Gabe is there. Just in terms of your answer to your question, I think it was done quite well by Gabe, actually, in terms of the levels of approval that come at a later date. At this point in time, what this is established is a charge for parkland, the way the parkland is delivered in the SGAs, the way they're designed in the SGAs, the overall status of our master plans and how we deliver parkland throughout the community are all pieces that will come and be finalized, and there'll be a full public consultation process through each one of those elements as we begin to see those communities emerge. Gabe?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, I'm not sure if there's more to that I can add. In reference to the parks plan, there's it notes different types of parks, whether they're sliver parks or pocket parks, etc. Those are examples of urban spaces within the SGAs. They're not exclusive to only those types. Again, we have to go through that design exercise to identify the shape of the parks, the location of those parks, what facilities we want in those parks. And I use parks in the sense that these are urban spaces which are going to look a little bit different. They're not going to be the typical soccer pitches, diamonds, etc. There isn't necessarily the room to do that. Now, I take your point quite well, Councillor, that there's a need for active parkland. Absolutely. The shape of that may be different. How it gets delivered might be different within our SGAs.
Okay. So
Councillor Hasletiel, if I may, I'd like to supplement their answers for you. I want to stress that the flexibility always exists for council because of several key factors. The first is these decisions you're talking about are not yet being made. And so council's freedom and flexibility is full on that front. Second, just about everything we do in Ontario is required by the province to be reviewed on a regular basis and updated or changed or adjusted as circumstances may suggest. And third, council always has the ability to amend its policies and its bylaws. And therefore, I would submit to you that you have all the flexibility in the world, and it helps if you can keep in mind that it's a stepwise process, and each one leads to the next one, and every one of them then gets backed up and reviewed as we go through the years. So please rest easy about council's flexibility.
So just to clarify, though, that would be a 2/3 vote that would be required to reverse something. Is that correct?
No, not necessarily. And I don't know, when we do a review, It's not a reconsideration. It's a statutorily required review. If you want to reverse something in the current term of council, then it's a reconsideration. But in all of the examples I gave you, there's no such difficulty.
Okay. So I'll move on to my other questions. Could Director Charles or Chris Marks comment on the ability to provide a public information session for the residents associations and other public members who would like to understand the parks plan more thoroughly? In discussions with them earlier today, they've asked for additional time to comment. The summer has gotten away from them. We normally don't do such an intense amount of consultation in the summer. I understand the deadline, but is it possible for us to meet the request of the RAs and the delegate tonight?
Through you, Mayor Burton, I just also wanted to reiterate that the June workshop is online, and the public is certainly encouraged to review that session to learn more information about the park strategy. We will commit to a public consultation. The time is very tight, but we do understand Councillor Hesselfield the desire to meet with the resident association, so we will work with our consultant to plan a fulsome public meeting to include residents association as well as the public, and we'll be announcing that very shortly. So it will be likely towards the end of this month or very, very early in September, but likely towards the end of this month.
All right, thanks very much for that. My other questions are just around some language in the report talks about acquiring parkland for the benefit of the entirety of the town. And I'm just wondering, the report opens with talking about fairness, equity, consistency, and transparency. And I can appreciate that there may be pockets in the town where there is less parkland and it's needed. But is there a fundamental principle of local neighborhood first? And in particular, does that apply to the SGAs?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, thank you for that question. The idea of this parks plan is the generation of land within appropriate areas, and where land does not exist, cash in lieu to be spent by the town to augment the supply of housing, the supply of parkland where it is needed. Now, part of the recommendations, let's focus on the SGAs. It's, I guess it's not very clear because it hasn't been correctly articulated by some of the questions tonight, but the understanding is that in the SGAs, there's no possible way to achieve 2.2 hectares per 1,000 people in a high density or mid to high density build form. The land does not exist. It creates more land than exists. So what that means is that the opportunity to apply a metric to achieve land in the strategic growth areas and to generate cash to acquire lands elsewhere is a huge opportunity. The goal for the municipality is, when cash is generated, to have a strategy in place to acquire land where it is needed within the town. That could be in proximity to strategic growth areas, or it could be anywhere in the town where there is a perceived deficit of parkland. The goal, though, is that the town does need to establish a parkland to utilize the cash in lieu that is generated.
So, Mr. Palmer, can I just ask you then to clarify for me? So everybody seems pretty adamant that we can't hit this 2.2 hectares per 1,000 people. And yet we're also hearing some comments about the metrics from the developers. Have other municipalities established a overall parks design in SGAs that establishes the amount of parkland that is doable before they've passed a parks plan? Or are we to just accept the hierarchy and the overall formula, and then thereafter, things get sorted out?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, that's a good question too. What I've identified in this parks plan are some metrics for a typical urban district for an appropriate urban park system. How that is articulated is really subject to a secondary plan process. So you identify X number of hectares in the strategic growth area, and that becomes the principal parkland system through which you use the development around it to pay for it and to acquire the land. But as I said, and I didn't say 2.2 is not achievable, it's not achievable in a strategic growth area. Because if you apply 2.2 hectares per 1,000 people, very, very quickly, you are into multiples of the actual land area. It's not mathematically possible. So the goal, again, get that, the framework for the parkland system identified and articulated in the secondary plan or district plan for the strategic growth areas, generate the revenue, get the land, get all the pieces you can get. And in the parks plan, I've identified a hierarchy of park spaces for strategic growth areas. I've included some general design guidance on how they might look and what they can function as. But again, you're going to generate revenue through cash in lieu to augment the park supply outside of the strategic growth areas, so that on a town-wide basis, you are still achieving 2.2 hectares per 1,000 people as the starting point. And as I'm sure you all know, that number comes from your Parks and Recreation and Libraries Master Plan that I believe I heard is going to be updated next year. So that's kind of the starting point we took. I like your concept of equitable distribution and making sure that existing Oakville, if there are deficiencies, that those can be rectified through further acquisition based on the cash in lieu generated through the strategic growth area.
So thank you very much for all those comments. Where we would fundamentally disagree is, while we absolutely should be thinking about those where there's deficiencies, it should not be at the detriment to those that will be living in a strategic growth area where density is significantly greater, and the need for green space and the need for mental and physical enjoyment of a treed canopy that with more softscape than hardscape. If the intent of this is truly going to deliver a vibrant, healthy, sustainable, community that's complete, then they need the park within the walking area of it. And there's lots of great stuff in this report. I'm not in any way questioning that. I'm just concerned that it's clear that things like sliver parks are not parks, and it's not a paradigm shift. They're extended sidewalks. A connecting lake is a sidewalk. It is not a park. And we're including them as parks, and I think it's eroding the importance and the value that we all have put on parks over the years, and that these specific strategic growth areas need as well. And so I'm just challenging us to think and make sure we do not do less for those in the strategic growth areas than we would do in our own neighborhoods. But thank you for the time tonight.
Thank you, Councillor. Mr. Palmer, I'd like to ask you to clarify that the 2.2, is the 2.2 hectares per 1,000 a town-wide standard or a neighborhood by neighborhood standard? Are we are we mistakenly seeking to apply to a particular area a general standard?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The 2.2 hectares per thousand people is a townwide standard to be achieved in the lifetime of this bylaw, this plan, in accordance with the Parks and Recreation and Library Master Plan.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Councillor Giddings and then Councillor Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A lot of my questions have already been asked. Quickly, it sounds like every councillor that has weighed in is interested in keeping as much space as they can in their development areas. So it's going to be interesting discussions moving forward. There was, for Mr. Charles, talking about looking at each strategic growth area. Will that be done individually? Will it be done? Just wondering what that process will look like ahead of time as they come up, as the development apps come in.
Thank you, Councillor, and through you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, that would be on a case-by-case basis as each review for our growth areas is coming up. Not too different from what happened through the Brawny Go, what we're doing through Midtown right now, where we do look at it comprehensively as part of the planning and design exercise.
So specifically on Midtown, we've got an OPA coming through sometime next spring that may alter the number of residents that were originally planned in that area. So we've got a low and a high number of what could be there at build out. How do we plan for that going forward a decade or two, or possibly 3 or more?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the exercise that was undertaken through Midtown was to identify those reasonable locations where we think makes the most amount of sense to deliver parkland. And what's illustrated on the land use schedule, again, these are draft and subject to change and will change and evolve over the next few months, that identifies on those schedules the public parkland requirement in order to deliver a complete community which will have a minimum population of 20,600 people and jobs per hectare. One of the other policies that is in the draft OPA identifies the intent of providing additional parkland from a private perspective. So this would account for the ability to secure things like POPs or strata arrangements within Midtown. So therefore, as the development proceeds, there's opportunities to capture additional parkland opportunities. Again, with full public access to those lands. Maybe not necessarily under a fee simple situation, but at least it provides that parkland opportunities for the population that'll be living in Midtown.
Looking forward to the report in September. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councillor Giddings. Councillor Grant.
Thank you. And obviously, all this ground is well worn. I do just want to say I appreciate what you'd said to our speakers today from the development community. Especially the second speaker, I was somewhat angry with the concept of the idea that, well, we're just going to run the province if you don't like what we're doing. I understand with the development community that their plan is to shovel as many people as they can into as small a space as possible. But we are the ones who have to make sure that these places are livable long-term. And that's pretty much the idea of the parks plan. So I think there are no questions. Everything's been asked. That's just really all I had to say.
Thank you, Councillor Grant. Thank you, everybody. I think we've reached a point where we need to make a decision, which is really just to receive and expect. Councillor Adams, thank you for the motion. I would like to ask you, Councillor Adams, if you would add to the draft motion, which reads that the report from the Planning Services Department, Parks and Open Space Department, and Finance Department, dated August 2nd, regarding the town's Parks Plan 2031 and draft Parkland Dedication Bylaw be received. I wonder if you would be good enough to add, and that staff consider if the draft Parks Plan 2031 needs additional protections on top of the protections already inherent in the Greenbelt and the Parkway Belt West and the ANSI protections that are already in place in what I regard as a terrific potential eco park in the more than 2,100 acres north of Highway 407 in Oakville, which is almost all Greenbelt and Parkway Belt and ANSI. And in the parks plan, and that's the addition I'd like. And I just would go on to say that I can't help but notice that there's a gigantic opportunity there to layer on the additional protection of being town-owned park space on these lands if we were to conceive of them as an eco park. And that would help reduce, we have a fear from time to time that the province might nibble away at the Greenbelt. And this would be a terrific way not only to achieve one of the goals in the Parks Plan 2031, if we were to set our minds to this, but it would also be an amazing legacy to the future to have as much as a 2,100 acre eco park. For comparison, Central Park in New York is 800 acres and High Park in Toronto is 400 acres. And 2,000 would be a pretty significant increase. Can I get that from you?
Yes, I think it would be an excellent thing for our staff to consider that opportunity. I think it's a great vision to consider the future for Oakville to have that kind of a large space that can be used in that eco park kind of fashion that's described in this report. The other thing I think that I'd like to just make sure is incorporated within that is the understanding that staff are going to continue with another public consultation program over the next couple of weeks that Director Mark spoke about.
Yeah, I think that commitment was clear. Many years ago in the early 80s, another council here had the foresight to acquire the land that became North Park, and that was about 200 acres, as I recall. And so those who have come before us have done a similar thing to what I'm saying we need to think about doing for our future. Councillor Chisholm.
Thank you. Thank you, Worship. Just my naivety with respect to the number of acres of land to protect. Could you just clarify for me exactly what you're talking about?
In Oakville, above the 407, there are about 2,150 acres, and you just need a map, and you'll see on the northwest side of Oakville, above the 407, some people call it a panhandle or something, but that's our, it has the, let's see, it has the confluence of the 16-mile creek running through it. It has, there's lots of opportunities there for additional tree coverage to help us get to our 2057 40% tree canopy objective that we unanimously adopted. And it supports, it helps activate a key part of the proposed Parks Plan 2031 that talks about an eco park.
So the question is, it's not in our existing Parks and Recreation Library Master Plan. So we're moving in that direction to implement that into the master plan as part of our overall approach.
This motion asks staff to consider if eco parks need additional protections beyond what are there. Obviously, to get to activate this idea that I've revealed tonight, the next step would be the Parks, Rec, and Library Culture Master Plan. And, that's a regular process of what we do. I mean, the existing Parks, Rec, and Culture and Library Master Plan is where we unanimously established that our standard for parkland, for active parkland in Oakville is 2.2 hectares per 1,000 residents on a town-wide basis. That is our unanimous policy at the moment from the last time we did this. So thank you very much for the question and the opportunity to help clarify what I was saying. If I may, I'll put the vote Is there any objection to the motion as amended by Councillor Adams? Madam Clerk, with there being no objection, Councillor Adams' motion carries. Thank you, everybody. It's 9:15. We have been going steadily for almost 3 hours. And our next item is our Diversity and Inclusion Current State Inclusivity Report and some other important things, including our budget. And so I would suggest that we have all earned a 15-minute bio break. And unless you object, I'm going to call that recess. I don't see an objection, so we're in recess till 9:30. All right, Council, we're back in session, having had a well-earned recess after almost 3 hours of work. And hopefully we can now do the second half of our agenda tonight. The next item is our Diversity and Inclusion Current State Inclusivity Report. We have a presentation by Julie Clark, who's our Director of Strategy, Policy, and Communications. Ms. Clark, you have the floor and our attention.
Thank you. So Council has long championed the town's commitment to promoting a culture of inclusion and diversity by providing accessible and equitable programs, services, and facilities to our residents and employees. And as part of our ongoing efforts in this area, we committed to undertake a systems-wide assessment of the town's current state regarding inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, also known as IDEA, those practices and values. And we partnered with the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion to conduct this assessment, which took approximately 15 months to complete. And the purpose of tonight's presentation is to share the high-level results and next steps with Council. This was an in-depth assessment. It included several deliverables noted above, and it provides us with an important baseline on which to build. It not only looked at our policies, our procedures, and how we are embedding IDEA practices and values into our direction-setting documents, we also engaged the community and undertook our first ever staff diversity and inclusion survey. The result is a report that provides a holistic look at what we have in place and provides third-party expertise, insights, and recommendations to enhance what we are doing. Regarding the results, they're broken down into 4 main categories. The first was a review of over 50 policy documents to assess how we are formalizing IDEA practices and values in our workplace. The findings were that we have solid policies in place and there were no identifiable gaps. However, there are always improvements to be made, which include some changes to make the language clearer, to ensure the policies have greater presence and awareness, and that people know how to access them. Community engagement was an important part of this assessment, and we received feedback in 2 ways. We conducted 21 focus groups and interview sessions with over 60 community groups and organizations. We also conducted a community survey that received over 600 responses that were gathered from both in-person and online feedback. Most participants agreed that the town values inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility in the delivery of our programs and services and recognize the efforts being made in this area. We did have some feedback on mixed feelings when it comes to the town meeting the needs of the community, town communications, and representation in our workforce. Feelings were also mixed when it came to belonging. Over half of participants shared that they have been reluctant to participate in a town program because they felt they didn't belong. Barriers included things such as cost, lack of programming in languages other than English, and limited accessibility for those living with physical disabilities. And in terms of representation, most participants reported feeling that the composition of town staff is not representative of the residents of Oakville. So regarding our employee makeup, we did our first ever diversity and inclusion survey, and we had 944 of our staff complete that survey, which represents just under half of our employee base which is considered an average response for an employer doing this type of survey for the first time. In terms of our workforce, the demographic composition for underrepresented groups is lower than the town's overall population for women, racialized persons, and persons with a disability. However, we fare higher for Indigenous persons and the LGBTQ community in our workforce compared to the town's population. If we look further at management versus non-management, women have the highest representation in each group. Racialized persons are less represented in management roles. Straight, white, able-bodied men are more represented in management roles. And Indigenous persons were least represented. We also looked at the employees' feelings of inclusion, and the charts here note positive responses to the top 3 and the bottom 3 statements. Encouragingly, over 80% of employees feel that the person they report to promotes a respectful and inclusive workforce. We also see positive results on being treated fairly and with respect by the people they serve, and that their workplace does not tolerate inappropriate behavior. On the bottom 3, we see lower results, still above 50%, in the areas of career progression, having their unique value be recognized, and in having support with their physical and mental well-being. So even though they are on the lower side, they are still positive results on which to build. As part of the best practices review, we completed an employer benchmarking survey called a maturity meter that evaluates an organization's level of progress. And findings from the evaluation indicate that the town is recognizing the value of diversity and inclusion and is starting to implement programs within our existing vision and strategy framework. What that means is we are embedding these values into our direction-setting documents in our everyday work. It also found that we are building momentum and are looking to implement programs systematically across the organization and through community services. What that tells us is that we're headed in the right direction. And this is a journey, and this takes time to build. And we've been leaders in this area for a long time with our focus on diversity and inclusion dating back to 2003. A scan of municipalities and other industries for best practices in diversity and inclusion was also undertaken and will be included in the development of our multi-year plan, along with key performance indicators that will help us to measure progress and stay on track. When we look at the entire report, and as mentioned, it is attached as Appendix A, and there is a lot to unpack in that report, but we do see several key findings. Again, we go back to the town is recognized for having prioritized IDEA practices and values from both an employee and a community perspective. However, they do note there are some attitudinal barriers on accommodations that may be impacting our staff's physical and mental well-being. And there appears to be a disconnect between the content and the spirit of the harassment and discrimination policies, which is something we will be looking into further. There are potentially procedural and attitudinal barriers to the hiring and career advancement of typically underrepresented groups at the town. And there's an opportunity to improve the inclusion experience for typically underrepresented groups by providing accessible workplace and community programs. So as we look forward to the development of our multi-year plan, we continue to engage the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion to support the development of this first multi-year plan. And we will be returning to Council early in the first quarter of 2023 in January with a draft plan. And the draft plan will be open for further feedback from both Council and the community. And we'll take any feedback received and return to Council by the end of the first quarter in 2023, March, with a final multi-year plan for Council's approval. So on that note, I do have some director colleagues, both here in person and online, and we would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Director, for the interesting report. The first question is from Councillor Adams.
Thanks very much for the report. I very much appreciate all the work that staff have done over the last many months on this issue and the many months that are to come before us. And I know it's a long-term issue. It's not something that happens just overnight. I just have one question of clarification. In your slides, you talk about comparing the town of Oakville workforce to the Oakville population. I wondered, the Oakville population numbers, were they the Toronto labor numbers, or are they specific to the geography of Oakville? And will we be able to compare our more recent town of Oakville workforce numbers to the new census information as it comes out?
That's a good question. So it is Oakville specific, and it was using the 2016 census. The 2021 census wasn't available at the time, but yes, we can do that comparison.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and congratulations to all the staff that are involved in doing the survey work and the report. I appreciate all of that, and I look forward to the multi-year plan coming forward.
Thank you, Councillor Adams. Councillor Longo.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Director Clark. Just a quick question. What's the frequency of the employee survey as it's related to the IDEAL program? Or IDEA program, sorry.
So this, as I mentioned, was our first ever survey. The plan is to survey again. We need to build, the 50% rating is an indication of trust and a little bit of uncertainty on what we're doing with this. So we do have to build trust. We will be surveying again. The frequency of that would be identified as part of the multi-year plan.
Okay.
Is how often we want to go back for that.
And echoing what Councillor Adams said, it is a journey, so this is obviously a great start to it, and look forward to seeing the action plans that come out. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Longo. Councillor Robertson.
My question goes to the role of unions, since a great deal of our staff is unionized. How does it work in terms of union leadership and how it's done if the perceived harassment, becomes a problem to deal with because of union protection? How do all those things come into how we can be better at this?
I'm going to refer that to our Director of HR.
Thank you, Councillor Robertson, and through you, Mr. Mayor. Our unions have been a partner in our surveying and in this process. They are sitting on our teams. And certainly when it comes to a harassment complaint, what you're speaking about, they are party to it in terms of the support to the employees and are involved in the outcomes.
Thank you very much, and this was a great report. I'm really happy to see how much we do. It's awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Robertson. Councillor Elgar.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Burton. Just a question regarding the 50%. Was it sent to 100% of the employees and only like 49.2% responded? Is that how it worked?
Yes.
Okay. Now I understand what you were saying. We have to build trust.
Mm-hmm.
Got it.
And as I said, that's an average response rate for a first-time survey of this kind.
Okay. And what is the average response rate the second time? Around like what's the experience? What did they say?
So it can be as high as in the 70% with multiple surveys and demonstrated outcomes from the action plan. That would be the highlight.
So you are going to provide us with the information based on 2021 statistics, like that is available now? Or
yes, it wasn't available when the report was first done, but yes, we can take a look at that.
Okay, that's great. I thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Councillor Elgar. If I might, I have a question. On one of your bullet points, you talked about attitudinal barriers with regard to accommodations. Can you give us one or two colorful examples, or colorful or otherwise, examples of what an attitudinal barrier to accommodations might look like or feel like?
Yeah, we certainly can. I'm going to refer that over to Director Ashmore.
This is a really good question, and Mr. Mayor, that we will need to explore further as we continue to engage our employee population to determine what those barriers are. I think what the report showed us was that our policies exist, and but we don't have a lot of requests coming in, so it's whether people feel that making that request has a limitation or is a barrier in of itself. And so we need to do more education, provide more clarity, and it is a great opportunity, and the accommodation policy was one of our policies that was up for refresh and review. So all of that consultation will take place now that we have this feedback.
Oh, okay, so I think I now understand that it's your attitudinal barrier refers to people being reluctant to apply for accommodation.
Potentially, that could be one conclusion that you could draw, but again, we will want to consult with the employees to determine what those insights from CCDI mean to them.
All right, well, thank you for this. As you know, Council has been unanimous for 16 years in wanting to go down this inclusion, diversity, and equity path, and we're very pleased to see you doing it. And Council stands ready to help you convey to our employees just how committed and serious we are to that. So thanks very much for this opportunity. Councillor Adams, can I look to you for the indicated motion to receive on this item?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll put the vote. Is there an objection to the motion to receive? Madam Clerk, there's no objection. The motion carries. Thank you, everybody. Council, the next item is the Halton Digital Access Strategy Implementation Plan. And this is a very complete and simple report. And basically it boils down to we're going to work in concert with Halton, which only makes sense since we share infrastructure. Councillor Adams.
I'll give you a motion to approve the recommendation within the report.
Thank you. This is the motion that the report be received, that staff proceed with the implementation plan for a one-window approach to support the implementation of 5G technology across Halton, as outlined in the report, and report back to Council for final approvals in early 2023, and that we forward a copy of this report to our partners in Halton, and that includes our hydro utilities, all of which are also involved. Any I called, there's no objection to the report, that's carried. So I was just telling the public what we passed. That brings us to one of the meatier items we have before us tonight, and that is the 2023 budget forecast and direction. And we have a presentation by our Deputy Treasurer and Director of Finance, Jonathan van der Heijden. And he's already in place and raring to go. Mr. van der Heijden, you have our attention, and you have the floor.
All right, thank you very much, and good evening, Mayor and members of Council. I'd like to take a few minutes this evening to give you a brief update on our 2023 budget process. So as you can see on the screen in front of you, there's a few highlights that I'd like to touch on tonight. The first will be the guideline that was previously established by Council. The next will be some preliminary assumptions that staff are working with for the budget. We're also going to touch on some pressures and risks that we have to consider as an organization. And we'll also talk about some potential mitigation that might assist us in achieving any targeted tax rate increase. I'd also like to touch briefly on the capital budget process, as well as reminding Council of the Budget Committee referrals that have already been made this year. And I'll finish off with a brief timeline of looking ahead to approving the 2023 budget in early 2023. So just to set the stage a little bit, this Council has previously directed that the 2021, 2022, and 2023 budgets be prepared, keeping the overall property tax increase in line with inflation. And the inflation forecasts in the Bank of Canada's July Monetary Policy Report have been revised up by almost 2 percentage points to 7.2% for 2022, by 8.1 percentage points to 4.6% in 2023, the figure you see on the screen in front of you, and by a little bit up to 2.3% in 2024. So unlike the past decade or so of budgets where inflation has remained relatively stable, the current economic and inflation environment makes it difficult to determine what the tax increase should be. So to help show the potential increases, I'm going to put up a couple of charts that are similar to the ones we use in the budget presentation process, just to help visualize a little bit about what the tax bill increase would be or could be, breaking down the town, education, and regional parts. So first up, in order to achieve Council's direction of an overall increase of 4.6%, as based on that Bank of Canada inflation forecast I just talked about, the town's share of the increase after assessment growth, which is currently estimated at 1.5%, would be calculated as 8.34%, and that assumes an increase of 3% for the region, and that's based on their recent budget report, as well as a 0% increase for education. Now, when inflation is running as hot as it is right now, this puts a lot of pressure on residents and businesses, as well as on the town's budget. And it's important that we recognize these impacts and the impact a tax increase will have as we try to strike the right balance between them in considering this year's budget. In addition, we also know that the town has some pent-up pressure on some of the services that we offer, and those will need to be considered as well, and I'll touch more on those in a minute. So what could we do? In trying to consider this balance, staff will also prepare service reduction options for the Budget Committee to consider to achieve a town increase of 4.6%, along with a capital levy increase of 1%, and then combining that with the same assumptions related to the assessment, again, estimated at 1.5%, as well as the same assumptions for the region and education, that would result in an overall increase of 3.46%. Now, our preliminary results show that we're sitting higher than this figure right now. When we come back to Budget Committee in early 2023, we will come with service reduction options that will need to be considered. Those will come along with any new requests for program and service needs so that committee and council can look to find the best balance between the needs and concerns of residents and businesses and the pressures that we face as a town. Now, I'd like to move a little bit on to some of the assumptions that we have been working with as we build this year's budget. So we'll touch on a number of items here. I'll bring them up one by one. So the first one relates to salaries and benefits. Every year as we build our budget, we base the amounts that we include on our negotiated contracts, as well as estimates for any increases related to ongoing negotiations. And this year we have negotiations with OPFFA and both CUPE unions. The next item to touch on is a 50% increase to fuel rates for a $2.5 million impact. I don't think this comes as a surprise to anyone if you fill your car up at the pump right now, but that does have a big impact on our budget. The next item up is a 4.6% inflationary increase to rates and fees, which would also generate about a $2.5 million impact. There are a couple of COVID items to touch on. So in the 2022 budget, we had a number of COVID impacts, as well as hoping for some government support to fund those items. And all of those have been reversed to kind of reset or eliminate COVID impacts from our budget. So we're starting at the right base. We did the same approach last year. However, this year, there are no 2023 COVID impacts being included, with the exception of transit, as they're expecting a slower than anticipated recovery in ridership. And we're estimating that to be about $3 million for next year. One of our other key assumptions is the 1% capital levy increase that will be included. The assessment growth that I mentioned already of 1.5%. And currently we don't have any tax stabilization funding included, but that would certainly be something that we could consider as one of the budget mitigation measures. And I'll touch on that a little bit more later. So switching from assumptions into some of the pressures and risks that we face, I'm just going to touch on these. Many of them are in the staff report as well. The first one is the high inflation that I've already mentioned. The next one is staffing. So the labor market has certainly changed in the past year, and staffing costs are a significant part of the town's operations and our budget. So those effects are being felt throughout the organization. COVID impacts is here again. I mentioned this a few minutes ago in the assumptions. And I don't think it's a surprise that COVID has had an impact on our operations, especially in areas like transit. And that includes the impact that it has on the budget. So hopefully we won't experience any more lockdowns, as these do impact the ability of the town to collect on some of our revenues. The next pressure and risk that we need to consider as we build the budget is the province. We've included this item as we need to learn a little bit more about what the new provincial government's priorities are, especially when it comes to planning regulations and the impact that may have on planning fees. And that also pertains to any future COVID-related funding that they may offer. Economic uncertainty. In addition to the inflation concerns, there has been some talk of a possible recession in the future. And if we look back about 15 years, we saw that this can have an impact on development and the development fees that we collect as an organization. Economic uncertainty is also relevant for the conversations about rates and fees as we look to strike the balance between the impact of higher fees on residents against the need to cover program costs to reduce any additional burden on the tax levy. And finally, we know that there are some key initiatives that the town wants to undertake, and there are some pent-up staffing needs that need to be addressed, and these will need to have to be considered as part of the budget process as well. Now, earlier I mentioned some potential mitigation measures, and the first one that I've got listed on the screen here is the status of our stabilization reserves. They are quite strong, and this will help us should we see a decrease in any of our external revenues or need to support any one-time mitigation funding. The next item up there is government funding. We are always hopeful for and looking at funding from other levels of government, and that does tend to be on the capital side of things, but we are always looking to take advantage of that as an organization. And finally, as I stated above, one of the things that we'll need to do is to bring back some service reduction options to the committee for their consideration when we get to budget committee time. Before I end my brief presentation, I did want to touch on our capital forecast and our capital budget. So staff have just finished off submitting all of their capital projects and updates and timing and those sorts of things. And finance staff will be going through those as well. We are also going to take a look at some of our pending capital projects that were previously approved but haven't been started yet, and consider reprioritizing those alongside the new request to ensure that we're putting forward the best projects for us to work on. That's also an opportunity for us to consider any inflation impacts or supply chain concerns that may arise. And the last major bullet on here talks about the need where we have to look at all of our projects to ensure that they are in line with council's priorities. And more specifically for our infrastructure renewal items, we ensure that these are done alongside of our asset management planning. And for any growth-related projects, we ensure they're in line with our DC study. Talking a little bit about some of the budget referrals that have been made. So earlier this year, 2 different items were identified through other council meetings that were referred to budget committee. One relates to streetscaping for Kerr Village and some other areas. And the second one relates to a tax rebate program for the heritage properties. And both of these items will have staff reports prepared on them that will be considered by the budget committee as part of the process. And finally, I'd like to just end with this slide here. It gives a little bit of an overview of the timeline. It is a bit of a different budget process this year. But you can see there that we're currently in August. As I said a minute ago, the preliminary budgets have just closed, and now finance staff will be able to review them and work with senior management to look at them, so that we will be able to be ready for budget committee meetings in January with a goal of approving the budget in late February or early March of 2023. So that's the end of my presentation, but I would be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. van der Heijden. Councillor Grant is first up.
Thank you. How much of a deep dive can I do right now? I have some concerns in your presentation and in the presentation documents I read. You keep talking about transit being a problem, transit not making money back. We can't increase transit costs to the end user. It's already at a level that is very high considering what people get compared to other areas. And so I'm very concerned about the fact that if we're going to keep talking about how transit needs to be paying for itself and that we don't want to charge taxpayers for it, that the money is going to go down to, charging the end user. And the end users, unfortunately, are people who really can't afford to pay that much for transit. So again, if we're not in trying to do a preliminary thing and not a really deep dive on the transit budget, I'm concerned how far we're talking about dealing with this.
So through you, Mayor Burton. So your concerns are well noted, and I think one of the things we need to consider is probably two separate items. One are the rates and fees that we have, because that is part of our budget, and how we increase those. That's one part, and the other part is what are our transit services and what are the costs? And the estimate that's in there for $3 million is a high-level estimate based off of the ridership numbers. And as time goes, and the benefits of us having a later budget this year is we'll have even newer information. And we can probably provide you a much more fulsome answer at that time as to where ridership is sitting and what that means for transit.
And that's why I'm bringing it up this early. I just want to get my my coins in this fast, as they say. On top of that, when we're talking about deferrals on projects, I'm very concerned about the fact that fire station number 4 was a temporary fire station 40 years ago. We have been promising the firefighters who have been living that station through different fire chiefs over and over again, budget time over budget time, that that station will be renovated, and yet all we ever do is just come up with band-aid solutions for them. They are living in poor conditions in fire station number 4, and we had promised them that at least next year, next budget year, or the following year, we would have the chance to renovate that fire station. And again, getting my comments in early for the budget committee. I do not want us to try and push that project back even further. Throughout the town, we have been making new facilities for people. We've been making new fire stations, and yet the firefighters who work out of number 4 are again dealing with conditions that are just disgusting. So I'm hoping that we don't lose sight of that, the fire budget.
Thank you, Councillor.
Question. These are comments, and I apologize.
We understand the sentiment, and we realize it's not a question. Thank you for the comment. Councillor Duddick?
Thank you, through you, Your Worship. This obviously, as you have mentioned early in your presentation, does not come as a surprise, fully anticipating this is what we were going to be dealing with. If and when something is being brought back to us, realizing that there's still people who are greatly impacted by COVID, as well as their, what shall I say, employment situation, plus the increase that we're all experiencing, whether it's with groceries, gas, whatever. Will there be something that staff can provide in terms of, and I don't want to say a deferral, but something to either phase in something for those who can't take the big sticker shock at the first beginning of this? I'm thinking more in terms of seniors and young families who, you know, basically are going paycheck to paycheck, sometimes not even that. So I'm just planting the seed that maybe that's something we should early on take into consideration, is how we can assist, knowing that we still have to be fiscally responsible, but also being acknowledging what so many of us are dealing with in the community in terms of tight on funds. The other ask I was going to have, and I know it's preliminary at this stage, have you had any indication from our neighboring municipalities in terms of what kind of figures they're looking at? I mean, we've seen the regions, but have you heard from, say, Burlington, Milton, Halton Hills, and maybe Mississauga, what their preliminary figures are looking like? Or is it too early in the process for them?
Through you, Mayor Burton, we have had some of those conversations. I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. I'm looking at Commissioner Sully, if you remember them. No. Yeah, some of them are quite high. I was talking to the Director of Finance for another organization today who had a very similar number to ours as well. So as we learn more information, we can certainly provide that back as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Duddick. Councillor Elgar?
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Burton. Thanks for the presentation. You had one slide up there that I think is pretty important. That I know you start reading the front of the report, it's 4.6% for the town. but when you're done, you were saying it would be 3.46% if you have education, region, and town all in place. That's correct?
Through you, Mayor Burton, that is correct. So because the town is about 42% of the tax, of the tax bill, if you were to have 4.6 for the town plus a 1% capital levy, once you factor in the region share we're estimating at 3%, plus the education factor at 0%, that the math on that would work out to 3.46.
Now, does your math at 3.46% increase or include already the 50% increase in fuel, which is what, 2.5 million? Is that already in your bottom line 3.46, or is that another addition you haven't put in yet?
Through you, Mayor Burton. So that number, that 4.6%, would be a target that we can provide to council. That is more about looking ahead as to what the number could be, as opposed to a number of items making up that 4.6%.
Well, that's okay though. But you've got all your fuel increases and your other increases in transit. That's all factored into the 4.6%.
So what we would need to, so through you, Mayor Burton, what we would need to do is we would need to factor all of those items in along with any new requests, possibly some service reduction options to get to that 4.6%.
Oh,
we're not currently sitting at 4.6%, if that makes it a little more clear.
That makes it a heck of a lot more clear. I do appreciate that. But okay, well, yeah, you know what? Based on where you see even salaries and with inflation and everything, it's a big number, and we'll see. But you're right about gas pumps. If anybody pulls up to the gas pump and takes a look at what it costs to fill a tank, yeah, it's not a shock. And we do have a lot of vehicles. You said it's going up 2.5 million. So how much is our gas? What is our fuel cost now annually?
Working the math on that through your Mayor Burton, working the math on that, it's about 5 million, but don't quote me on that number. That's just working backwards. I can get you a better number if you'd like.
No, I'm sure it'll be coming later. So, okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the update.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah, the important thing to remember is that in past situations that we've faced these situations before. And this council has shown that it knows how to, A, postpone things, B, do a value assessment of services to make them more efficient, and C, to feather in council's desired improvements so that you don't take the full bite in the full year. So you have a lot of tools that you've used before, and there's lots of reason for the public to have confidence in a good result because you've always delivered a good result. So is one of you willing to deliver the motion to receive that's indicated? Is that you, Councillor Adams?
Yes, and with thanks to staff for the report, I recognize that we're in financially much better situation than many of our colleague municipalities around us. And so I look forward to continuing working with staff on making sure that we land well next year.
Thank you very much. Any objection to Councillor Adams' motion? Madam Clerk, there being none, that carries. Council, the promised motion authorizing me to seek relief on the noise regulation front from the province is in front of you next. It was moved by me and seconded by Councillor Adams according with the procedure bylaw at a previous series of meetings. Is there any objection or speakers to this? If not, I'll put the vote. Any objection? There being none, that's carried. Thank you. I'll just add that I will be taking the same concept to the big city mayors. As you know, there's 28 municipalities with 100,000 people or more in Ontario, and together we represent 70% of the population. And I can tell you that the other mayors share our concern. So we will be heard. And I think I should point out there's another feature of Bill 215 that is little noted, and that is that on a case-by-case basis, you can apply to the minister for relief. And so, don't assume that nothing's possible. There's always something possible when we put our minds to it. We have no confidential discussion items. We have no advisory committee minutes. It would be in order for a motion to rise and report to council. Councillor Elgar, thank you. Any objection to that motion? There being none, that carries. I rise and report the Committee of the Whole has met and made recommendations on the consent items 7.1, 7.2, 7.3, 7.4, 7.5, and 7.6, and on discussion items 9.1 through 9.6 as noted by the clerk. A mover and seconder to adopt the report would be in order now. Councillor Chisholm and Councillor Grant, thank you. Any objection? There being none, the report is adopted. Council, you have your information items circulated electronically, your status of outstanding issues list, and we now come to new business, notices of motion, emergency, or congratulatory or condolence statements. Councillor Haslett-Deal.
Mayor Burton, I had a question on the status of outstanding issues for Director Charles.
Ask your question, please.
As everyone's aware, that there is continued concern about warehouses and the scale and intensity, and I wondered if you could just give us a brief status update on what we could expect in Q1 of 2023 in regards to the outstanding report.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, if I can answer that question on behalf of Director Charles. In the spring of 2023, we will be looking to our consultant, who we hope to retain shortly, to deliver a strategy on things that we could potentially do in the short term, zoning adjustments that might be achievable in the short term, as well as recommendations for inclusion in the employment study that will follow the official plan review, which will be completed later in 23 or early 24. So that is what we'll deliver, both short-term mitigation measures, if there are any available to us, as well as a bit of a strategy on how to address more comprehensively employment issues on a townwide basis.
Thank you, Commissioner, for that. Can you just further, when will council receive an official plan and sort of comprehensive zoning update next? Do you see that as being something we'll see in December of 2022? How soon would we see that?
I think we've got one scheduled for early in 23, but I will confirm that with staff and advise council accordingly.
Thanks very much. I appreciate the update.
Commissioner, maybe I could ask you if you might want to clarify that. I know that we have a deadline of July 1st for an official plan amendment to conform our official plan to the new region's official plan and the province's changes. But normally, our zoning bylaw doesn't come at the same time as the official plan. The last time we did a conforming zoning bylaw, it followed the official plan amendment. And, you know, if you stop and think about it, it's logical that you got to pass the official plan amendment before you have something to conform the zoning bylaw to. And I believe in zone, you weren't here, Commissioner, but CAO Closey, was that a 2-year process?
Livable Oakville was approved, I think, in 2009, and it wasn't until 2014 that we brought in the zoning bylaw for approval.
Yeah. So I just put that out there so that we don't accidentally encourage unrealistic expectations about when the zoning bylaw can happen or how fast that can happen, given that, you know, we have experience to help us shape those expectations. Councillor Haslett-Deal?
Yeah, so my question really was just to ask for that official plan and comprehensive zoning work plan that would give that clarity to the public around what they can expect in terms of timing, et cetera. I mean, it needs to be said that there's a need to get to the comprehensive zoning bylaw much more quickly. I understand that we don't have tools and we have compliance issues with the region, but there is serious concerns about land use permissions abutting residential properties. And hopefully when we see the work plan, we start to see some progress before the end of 2023. But I take your point that these things are complex.
Well, there's quite a lot of public consultation required in both of those processes, and especially in the zoning. So I think it's helpful if we get that out there right in advance. Consultation eats up time, and we all want consultation too. No one bit or rose on notices of motion or emergency or congratulatory condolences. However, we do have requests for reports. Have we got requests for reports? Councillor Giddings.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Actually, I would like to bring a condolence to this council. This is from Ian Anderson House. It is with deep and profound sadness that we announce the death of our founder and matriarch, Margaret Anderson, on Sunday, August 7th. Margaret opened Ian Anderson House almost 25 years ago in honor of her late husband, Ian. At the time of Ian's death, there were no residential hospices in Ontario, and little support was available in terms of home care. At 25 years ago, no one saw the need for hospices, but Margaret, an extremely determined and tenacious woman, appealed to every level of government until her persistence paid off with the opening in November of 1997. Ian Anderson House is now one of the many residential hospices in Ontario, and her tireless catalyst for palliative care. I think it's only fair that we acknowledge what she's done for so many families in Oakville and surrounding areas, and Ian Anderson House has certainly touched a lot of us in our personal lives.
Thank you for that, Councillor Giddings. Many of us lost a very dear friend with her passing, and we all appreciate your good words and endorse them, I'm sure. We have a request for report from Councillor Mark Grant, seconded by Councillor Jeff Knoll, that staff report on potential park uses on the McCraney Reservoir Park on completion of the region's master plan for the McCraney Reservoir. Is there any objection to that request for report? There being no objection, congratulations, Councillor Grant and Councillor Knoll, your request is approved. We have a request from Councillor Haslett-Thiel and Councillor Giddings for a report from staff to report back on options to allow the BIAs to recognize sponsors on signage for specific programs and activities. And the request for report, I'll come to you in a second, Councillor Adams. The request for report acknowledges that there are currently limitations within our sign bylaw that impact the ways the BIAs can recognize the contribution and efforts of sponsors and partners on signage for an event or activity. And I will support the request for report because I think it's timely to have a reminder from staff as to the success of Oakville's effort at, if not totally preventing, reducing the blight of billboards in our community, and our sign bylaw is intricately and carefully connected to that. Councillor Adams, your turn.
Thank you very much. And in consultation with my seatmate colleague here, Councillor Knoll, we wondered if the mover and seconder would be willing to add a little line to add in other town-sponsored events, and we're thinking about a number of the North Oakville related events that are town-sponsored, often run by volunteers, with funding from a host of different sponsors. And we have experienced situations where it's sometimes difficult to properly thank and recognize sponsors who are supporting those community events. And the two of us wondered if we could add in after the words to allow the BIAs to add in other town-sponsored events recognizing the events that are occurring elsewhere in town.
It appears that the mover nodded and she's raised her hand. Perhaps she wants to say in person whether she'll accept that or not.
So we expected that you would like to add that, and we would of course welcome that, because we really do think it's about being community, recognizing the contribution of businesses to the success of our community. And I'm hopeful that options can be found that balance the third-party advertising issue with being an opportunity to say thank you to those that give back in the business community. So thank you. And with that, we agree to the amendment.
All right, thank you, everybody, for all that unanimity. May I put the vote? Is there any objection to the request? There being none, that too is approved. Congratulations to all concerned. It now would be in order for a mover and seconder for consideration and reading of the bylaws. Councillor Longo and Councillor Robertson, thank you. Is there any objection? Councillor Hazard-Thiel, your hand is up. Are you objecting? All right. Then, Madam Clerk, there's no objection, and the consideration and reading of the bylaws motion has been successful. Council, thank you very much for the time and effort you put into this meeting and the outstanding questions and the great decisions that we made. It has really been terrific working with you, and I look forward to seeing everybody again. That ends our meeting.